Harper Audio presents Think a Second Time, written and read by me, Dennis Prager. I have written Think a Second Time because most people don't think a second time. Most of us form opinions about life's great issues at a young age and retain them forever. The reasons aren't hard to discern. It isn't comfortable to think through every issue. Serious thought is as strenuous as serious exercise. And as we age, most of us become preoccupied with other matters. This is sad because unclear thinking is a major source of social and personal problems. Take, for example, the question of whether human nature is basically good. Differing views on this question alone explain much of the liberal-conservative divide in our society. Your views on this issue can even profoundly affect your own happiness. In Chapter 1, I discuss why the belief that people are basically good is wrong. Who am I that you should want to read my thoughts on 19 subjects? Well, I am a highly passionate moderate. In fact, I'm so passionate and so moderate that I am even passionate about being moderate. I love life and goodness, and I hate cruelty. I want to hug every kind person and to inflict hurt on bad people. Yes, I believe in just revenge. I am religious and believe in God, but I readily acknowledge how much harm religious people have done, and I even have a tough time praying to God. What makes me tick is a desire to see good conquer evil, as corny as this may sound. But I have been preoccupied with good and evil ever since, as a child, I saw kids bully other kids. This preoccupation permeates every chapter of this book. I have always believed that if offered a choice between clarity and happiness, I would choose clarity, though I have come to believe that clarity, in fact, enhances happiness. These essays represent my yearning for clarity. Very different versions of some of these essays were published in my quarterly journal, Ultimate Issues, others in the Wall Street Journal and Los Angeles Times. I would be very pleased if every reader of this book agreed with every word in it. But if 13 years as a talk radio host are any indication, few readers will always agree with me, and few will always disagree. Many liberals, for example, will probably love my chapter on how religion can lead to cruelty, but be annoyed with my essay on how liberalism can lead to cruelty. That's the chapter, Blacks, Liberals, and the Los Angeles Riots. Religious readers will love my vigorous defense of God and religion-based ethics, but probably be troubled by my defense of men who attend a striptease show. But my primary goal is not agreement. It is to provoke the listener to think a second time. Los Angeles, California, July 1995. Human nature. Why the belief that people are basically good is wrong and dangerous. The belief that people are basically good is one of the most widely held beliefs in contemporary society, yet it is both untrue and destructive. To believe that human nature is basically good, after Auschwitz, the Gulag, Rwanda, Armenia, and Tibet, just to mention some of the horrors of the 20th century alone, is a statement of faith, as non-empirical as the most wishful religious belief. Whenever I meet people who persist in believing in the essential goodness of human nature, I know that I have met people for whom evidence is irrelevant. Just as no contrary evidence will shake many religious believers' faith, so none will shake the faith of many of those, especially the secular, who believe in humanity's goodness. If the falseness of this belief that man is basically good does not suffice to move a person to abandon it, perhaps this will. It is a belief that has particularly destructive consequences. The first of these is the attribution of all evil to causes outside of people. Since people are basically good, the bad they do must be caused by some external force. As a result, people are often not held responsible for the evil they commit, a notion that has become commonplace in America. A second consequence is the denial of evil. If good is natural, then bad must be unnatural or sick. Moral categories have been replaced by psychological ones. Third, parents and teachers will not feel the need to teach children how to be good. Why teach what comes naturally? Fourth, those who believe that evil comes from outside of people work on changing outside forces rather than on changing the evildoer's values. Fifth, and perhaps most destructive, the belief leads to the conclusion that people need to feel accountable for their behavior only to themselves, not to a God or a religious code higher than themselves. Those who believe in innate human goodness view the battle for a better world as primarily a struggle between the individual and society. I believe that especially in a free society, the battle is between the individual and his or her nature. A society can survive the collapse of its economy, but not of its citizens' morality. An America that emphasized character development in its public and private spheres was able to survive the poverty of the Great Depression. A vastly wealthier America that neglects character development is slowly sinking. And this neglect can be attributed in large part to the widespread belief that people are basically good and the destructive beliefs that accompany it. Don't judge motives. Assessing motives is usually pointless and often destructive. It is pointless because motives are almost impossible to determine. We often don't know our own, let alone others. And it's destructive because we almost always exaggerate the purity of our own motives and assign nefarious motives to others. The solution to this problem, in fact, the solution to much of humanity's problems, is this: we should judge actions, our own and others, not motives. When we discover that we have hurt someone's feelings, our first reaction usually is, "I didn't mean it." And because few of us do consciously set out to hurt another person, we feel that this exonerates us. By judging our motives rather than our actions, we can assuage guilt over any action or inaction. What we do, not what we intend, is what counts. Nearly all of us fall into this trap. Like most people, I long tended to judge negatively the motives of people with whom I disagreed. Only after years of hosting a radio talk show in which I speak daily with people whose views oppose mine, did I learn the great lesson that people with whom I disagree are just as likely to have the same good conscious motives that I ascribe to myself. Ascribing bad motives to one's ideological adversaries can be found throughout the political spectrum. But I have been particularly saddened by how often liberals ascribe mean or selfish motives to their opponents. For example, to vote Republican means voting with your pocketbook, whereas voting for a Democrat is to vote idealistically. During the Cold War, those of us who supported a large defense budget and the building of nuclear weapons were accused at various times of loving war, having a psychological need for enemies, hating Russians, supporting the military-industrial complex, having a Rambo mentality, and suffering from missile envy. The possibility was rarely considered that we were motivated by love of peace and justice. On the other hand, many conservatives have ascribed the foulest of motives, even murderous conspiracies, to one of their adversaries, President Bill Clinton. So please, no more assessments of motives. In matters of public policy, let's debate results, not motives. And in interpersonal relations, let's assess ourselves and others by actions, not intentions. Legislating goodness, the storekeeper law. There is a law in the Talmud with which even few Jews are acquainted, yet it is among the most ethically beautiful laws in Judaism. When properly understood and practiced, this law can have a measurable impact on a person's character and a society's quality of life. The law reads, one is not permitted to ask the storekeeper the price of an item if he knows he will not purchase it. It's found in Bava Metzia 58b. When a person asks a storekeeper the price of an item that he has no intention of buying, he is deceiving the storekeeper and actually robbing him of time. The law does not say that in order to be permitted to ask the price of an item, you must purchase it. The law allows comparison shopping. Only if you know that you will not buy the item from that particular store are you forbidden to inquire about its price. This law is as applicable today as when it was first formulated. Many men planning to buy photographic equipment will visit a retail camera store, take up the store's time deciding which equipment they want, then order that equipment from a less expensive mail order house, and they knew that they would order by mail the entire time. The most obvious reason the Talmud forbids such activity has already been noted. A seller's hopes have been raised in vain. But the reason goes deeper than that. Those who violate this law deliberately misleading people about one of the most important concerns in their life, their income. Whenever we try on a dress or ask the price of a camera, we are implying the possibility of buying the item, and this is precisely what the salesperson infers. Stores do not exist in order to show items for people to buy elsewhere. There is yet a third level to this law. It makes us keenly aware that we have obligations even toward people we generally regard as beyond our obligation. This in itself makes the storekeeper law particularly useful in contemporary society. Our society is obsessed with personal rights, but it will only survive if we each adopt personal obligations. Americans are frequently made aware of consumer rights, but this law makes it clear that there are also consumer obligations. The ultimate genius of this law is that it forces us to establish something of an I-you relationship with the person behind the counter, rather than retaining the usual I-it relationship that we have with people whom we meet only in a service capacity. Finally, this law can and ought to be applied to other areas of life. There are powerful ramifications to the principle that if you know that you are not going to buy, don't imply that you might. That is, don't raise expectations you know you won't meet. One such ramification was made clear to me when a young woman told me she wished the men she dated would live by the storekeeper law. So often men imply interest that is in fact not there. For men, one application of this law would read, do not sleep with a woman if you know that you have no intention of committing to her, or unless you have made that absolutely clear to her. The storekeeper law keeps you honest. Can a good man go to a striptease show? During the 1992 elections, I sent readers of my quarterly journal Ultimate Issues my first and only political fundraising letter. It was on behalf of Bruce Hershenson, a close friend and someone I have admired for over a decade. He was running for U.S. Senator from California. On the weekend before the election, with the race extremely close, Bob Mulholland, political director of the California Democratic Party, announced to the press that he had proof that Bruce had attended a strip show in Hollywood. When Barbara Boxer won the election, perhaps owing to this revelation about Hershenson, Mulholland announced that he planned to publicize the private lives of future Republican candidates. After the election, I received the following letter from an evangelical Christian reader. Dear Dennis, it has been bothering me for some time. I received a letter from you requesting that I vote for and support Bruce Hershenson. You mentioned that Bruce was of upstanding moral character. Well, the newspapers reported that Bruce had frequented nude girl shows. I have never heard Bruce deny it. Did you know this about Bruce, or is it untrue, or did it surprise you? Dear Sir, I don't know about frequented, but as Bruce and I are very close, I did know that he has been to a strip show. So have I, and so has just about every man that I know. Indeed, given the ubiquity of such shows in Las Vegas and the number of people I know who have seen a show there, I suspect that most of the women I know have been to a strip show. That includes my mother and my wife, two people whose characters I also vouch for. The real issue here is not Bruce Hershenson's character, it is one's views and one's religion's views regarding the sinfulness of sexual acts or even thoughts outside of marriage. As an evangelical Christian, you are heir to a religious tradition that has placed great emphasis on sexual sin. As heir to the Jewish religious tradition, I too believe that there is sexual sin. But in only some cases does sexual sin play the role in my thinking that it does for many Christians. Let me explain by briefly analyzing three issues. First, the nature of sexual sin. Second, the distinction between public and private behavior. And third, sexual sin and moral character. The nature of sexual sin. In sex, as in all other areas of life, there are gradations of sin. The ideal is monogamous, heterosexual marital sex. Less ideal, premarital heterosexual sex. Lower ideal, promiscuous non-marital heterosexual sex. Sinful, in alphabetical order, adultery, bestiality, incest between adults. As homosexuality deserves its own extended discussion, I omit reference to it here. And evil, rape, and all adult child sex. I recognize that this isn't how many Christians might draw up their list. Many Christians do not accept the notion of degree with regard to sin, sexual or otherwise. A sin is a sin. I disagree. Just as human beings distinguish between jaywalking and murder, so too God distinguishes between sins. To argue otherwise is to argue that humans are more just than God. Second, while the New Testament repeatedly condemns fornication, which is taken by Christians to mean any sexual conduct outside of marriage, the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, doesn't mention fornication. Its condemnations of sexual sin are reserved for adultery, homosexuality, incest, and bestiality. The Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and New Testament differ even more with regard to the sinfulness of sexual thoughts. The Gospel of Matthew cites Jesus as saying that if a man lusts after a woman, he has committed adultery with her in his heart. There is nothing analogous expressed in the Hebrew Bible. Its concern is with sinful actions, not thoughts. The one major exception is the 10th commandment, which prohibits coveting. But even though it specifies that one should not covet one's neighbor's wife, it never claims that lusting is a form of adultery or of coveting. Coveting is yearning to steal something or someone belonging to another. If the 10th commandment were interested in prohibiting sexual lust, it would have prohibited coveting any woman, not only our neighbor's wife. The essential distinction between public and private behavior. Regarding sexual matters, it is essential to distinguish between public and private behavior. For example, sexual modesty in the public sphere is crucial to the soul of a society. That is why I am opposed to the use of sex in advertising, as on billboards and in magazines and newspapers, sex on free television, gross talk on radio, and visible covers of pornographic magazines at newsstands. At the same time, the availability of explicit sex videos, magazines, and the like for private use does not necessarily damage society. We make distinctions between public and private behavior all the time. There is a world of difference between using 4-letter words in intimate private conversation and employing them publicly. The same holds true regarding bodily functions. We all urinate, yet we regard a person doing so in public as harming society. The difference between what we do publicly and what we do privately is essential to civilization's development. I believe that we can measure civilization in 2 ways. One is moral. How decent are a society's laws, and how much do its members observe those laws? The other is by the amount of distinction between the society's behavior and that of animals. The closer a society's behavior is to the animal kingdom, the less developed it is. One such distancing characteristic is the distinction that humans draw between public and private behavior. Animals rarely draw such a distinction. For example, they relieve themselves and have sexual relations in public. As for humans, however, while a married couple making love in private is beautiful, the same couple making love in public is indecent. Ironically, to many religious people, if you shouldn't do something in public, you shouldn't do it in private, while to many secular people, if you can do something in private, you should be able to do it in public, using expletives, for example. I find myself in the middle. We should allow all kinds of private sexual activities, but restrict what is aired on free television and radio. This distinction is in keeping with my religious tradition, which strongly distinguishes between public and private behavior. In the Talmud, Judaism's most important work after the Bible, Rabbi Eli observed about 1,500 years ago, quote, "If a man sees that his urge is prevailing upon him, let him go to a place where he is not known, and put on black garments, and let him do what his heart desires, but let him not profane the name of God publicly." Unquote. Sexual sin and moral character. It is also essential to distinguish between holiness and morality. While an immoral act is always unholy, not every unholy act is immoral. For example, murder is immoral and therefore also unholy. But premarital sex between consenting adults, while unholy according to all major religions, is not necessarily immoral. The identification of morality with holiness has seriously hurt both religion and morality. Religion has been hurt because identifying morality with sexual behavior has alienated many modern people from religion. Many modern people, like myself, identify morality with goodness, justice, compassion, that is, how we treat other human beings, not with issues of consensual sex. And morality has been hurt because identifying immorality with consensual behavior undermines the battle against real immorality, cruelty, and other forms of evil. But you might ask, isn't it true that by going to a strip show, a man is supporting women working as strippers? After all, how would I feel if my daughter became a stripper? As it happens, my wife and I certainly do have much greater hopes for our daughter. But I would be more disappointed in my daughter if she worked for Bob Mulholland of the California Democratic Party, who devotes his life to destroying the name of good people. I regard a man who visits a nude show the same way I regard a man who visits a casino. Neither act says anything about the person's character, unless he speaks out against such behavior, claims not to do it, and then engages in it. Otherwise, it is harmless, though certainly not ennobling behavior. The argument that women who strip are being hurt is just another way of saying that one is opposed to strip shows. It is also sexist. If a woman candidate had gone to a male striptease, no one would argue that she had harmed the men who were stripping. Does attending a strip show then reveal anything about a man? Probably not. It may only reveal a person's lack of consistency in religious conduct. If Bruce Hershenson had been a candidate for Chief Rabbi of Tel Aviv or Cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, I could understand taking cognizance of his attendance at a nude show. But he was running for the secular position of United States Senator. The Mulholland tactic therefore only revealed what I have long known. Many kind, honorable, and honest men sometimes go to strip shows, sometimes use curse words in private, sometimes play poker or go to a casino, and sometimes buy sexually explicit material. And the truly dishonorable men and women are those who pry into the lives of honorable people in order to ruin their good names. In vice, as in most other areas, I hold a moderate position. That is why I like the Talmud's response to the question, is it permitted to gamble? The majority ruling says yes, it is permitted to gamble, but only as long as one does not do so for a living, because then one is not engaged in making a better world. In other words, indulge your innocuous lower urges if you wish, but do so sparingly, because a noble person devotes his or her life to higher causes than sating one's appetites. Children. When good homes don't produce good children. There is a consensus in America that many homes have not been raising good children. There is little consensus, however, as to why. People blame, among other factors, television violence, the proliferation of handguns, the absence of fathers, violent music, poor schools, and the prevalence of poverty. And in varying degrees, these are all factors. But little attention is paid to assessing what parents are doing wrong, especially well-educated parents in intact homes where there are no guns, no violent music, and television viewing is monitored. Here then are some reasons why even these parents often fail to instill good values in their children. 1. Goodness is rarely put first. The problem with regard to parents raising good children is not that most parents don't want their children to be good people. It is that few parents actually make their child's goodness their primary concern. Most parents are more concerned with their child being a brilliant student or a good athlete or a successful professional. Parents might ask themselves these questions. Would I rather have a kind child with average intelligence and grades or a brilliant child who wasn't kind? What is the ratio of time that I devote to developing my child's ethics relative to developing his or her other achievements? Do I reward my child's acts of kindness as much as I reward good grades or making the football team? If my child needed to cheat just 10 points on just one exam in order to get into an elite college, would I be very unhappy if he did? And would he be certain that I was unhappy over his cheating? Do I insist repeatedly that my child thank people? I have also suggested that parents ask their child, whether the child be 10 or 50 years old, "What do you think I most want, or wanted if the child is left home, you to be? Happy, smart, successful, or good?" On my radio show, parents have repeatedly called to tell me how surprised and saddened they were to learn that their child placed good low on this list. Unfortunately, even responsible and loving parents often fail to make it clear that they care about their children's honesty and decency more than they care about their grades. It is difficult to raise a good student, but it is much more difficult to raise a good person. In the long run, however, the parents of good children who are only moderately successful are far happier than the parents of highly successful children who are only moderately good. While we are not born basically evil, neither are we innately good. We have tendencies in both directions. Goodness needs to be cultivated. It is an art that takes as much time and effort to master as violin playing. Yet far more parents give their children music lessons than goodness lessons. 2. An overemphasis on feelings. Many parents have come to value their children's feelings over their behavior. This caring about our children's feelings is a very positive development. Throughout history, children were usually regarded as parental possessions whose feelings were of little more concern than those of slaves or pets. But many parents have gone to the other extreme. How our child feels should be important to the child, to the parents, and to a handful of others, but to the rest of the world's more than 5 billion people, the only thing that matters is how the child acts. Our message given in love to our children must be, your right actions are more important than your feelings. Even if you're upset, you cannot hurt other people. Otherwise, we will end up with a society populated by well-understood barbarians. 3. The overemphasis on self-esteem. Too many contemporary parents overvalue self-esteem. Contrary to the almost religiously held belief among many educators and others that self-esteem is one of the most important ingredients in making responsible individuals, it is not nearly as important as values. In fact, some of the cruelest people, from mafia leaders to drug kings to communist and fascist leaders, think very highly of themselves. Self-esteem is very important in enabling a person to enjoy life, and when wedded to good behavior, in other words, when self-esteem is made contingent upon good works, it can be a powerful tool for developing character. But to be a good person, self-control is infinitely more important than self-esteem. 4. The absence of a higher code. Many parents, including perfectly decent ones, provide their children no higher code of values to which they, the parents and the children, hold themselves accountable. We can most trust people who believe that there is a higher code and authority that holds that antisocial behavior is wrong and believe that they are ultimately accountable to this code and authority. 5. An overemphasis on macro goodness. Many modern parents, when they think about idealism and compassion, immediately think of broad social concerns such as government caring for the poor. This too can be an obstacle to raising good children because there is no necessary connection between commitment to social concerns and honesty and kindness in one's personal life. Many young people think that being good only requires participating in a charity walk, organizing a petition, or attending a demonstration. As a result, they may feel free to cheat on a test, copy software, and ignore or insult the fat kid in class. 6. The belief in quality time. The human ability to rationalize is infinite. When well-educated parents choose to have a dual-career marriage and deny that a price in child-rearing must be paid, they develop the notion that what children really need from parents is quality time, not quantity of time. When it comes to time with children, quality cannot be fully separated from quantity. What does quality time even mean? That a parent and child who spend little time together will have a very meaningful conversation for an hour? Children open up when they want to, which is usually only after much non-quality conversation and time have been spent with their parents. Life consists of constant trade-offs. When we do X, we can't do Y. Without judging parents who have chosen career over time with their children, we can ask them not to fool themselves and the next generation of parents into believing that no price has been paid. It is not easy to raise a good person, as opposed to a person who is merely not bad. But if we honor children as individuals while following the moral guidelines offered above, making goodness our first priority, recognizing that human goodness does not come naturally, emphasizing behavior over feelings, stressing self-control even more than self-esteem, parenting children rather than aiming to be always liked by them, giving them a higher code to which they feel accountable, emphasizing personal ethics over social policy, and spending more time with them, we will have given the world what it most needs: good people. When adult children don't talk to their parents. A Los Angeles Times article opened my eyes to a frightening phenomenon in modern America. The article spoke of adult children who have decided never to speak to one or both of their parents. I had two immediate reactions. First, I wondered how widespread this phenomenon is. Second, though the article implied no such thing, I suspected that in many instances this behavior on the part of the child was wrong. As a radio talk show host, I am very fortunate in being able to bounce my ideas off many people of every background. I therefore decided to talk about this issue on both my Los Angeles and New York radio shows. In both cities, I was deluged with calls. I have no doubt that this horrifying phenomenon of a child utterly cutting him or herself off from parents is widespread. I became aware of something I had long suspected but could only now articulate. In many people, the therapeutic mentality has replaced the moral mentality. A personal story will help to illustrate the difference between these two mentalities. My paternal grandmother, may she rest in peace, was a very good woman. She spent most of her time collecting charity for poor neighbors. But she was a very tough woman to her family. Her toughness strongly contributed to neither of her daughters marrying, a particularly rare occurrence in a Jewish family and almost unheard of in an Orthodox Jewish home, and to other problems. After she was widowed in 1950, my father took it upon himself to see her every week and to call her every day. This was not easy. While she treated my brother and me beautifully, we may have been the only people to whom she showed tenderness. I vividly recall a nearly nightly ritual. After dinner, my father would call his mother, only to have her yell at him. We never spoke about this, but it made a deep impact on me. Despite her verbally abusive behavior, my father called his widowed mother every day. Growing up in a religious home, I instinctively understood my father's behavior. The Ten Commandments says, honor your father and mother. Likewise, my mother had many reasons not to prepare a lavish meal for my grandmother every Sunday afternoon, yet it never would have occurred to my mother to break off all contact with her husband's mother. My parents had a moral or a religious mentality, a mentality governed by shoulds. In the 1960s, a sea change took place. The moral religious mentality was replaced by the therapeutic mentality, which holds that there are no shoulds. Should became a dirty word. This was confirmed when nearly every person who spoke to me about a child not speaking to a parent mentioned that the child's therapist encouraged this behavior. Do some parents deserve no honor or respect from their children? Without question. But parenthood needs to be honored. Yes, there are cases of such evil that continued contact is impossible. But those cases are rare. Some of those who don't speak to their parents assert that they will raise their children in such a loving way that they, the parents, will ensure their children's enduring contact. The problem with this attitude is that parents who neglect their parent may be so afraid of losing their children's love that they will do anything to be loved by their child. And this is not a good way to raise a child. A child needs a parent, not just a friend. A note to the adult child. If you haven't been horribly abused, I believe that you have an obligation to maintain contact with your parents. The mere fact that you survived childhood is usually a credit to your parents having cared enough to see to it that you ate, were clothed, didn't drown, etc. If you are a parent, you know that this is no mean feat. By maintain contact, I do not mean show love nor even have a meaningful conversation, let alone an intimate relationship. Just maintain some formal contact. But to cut off all contact with a parent is the most painful thing you can do to that person. It is usually too cruel. If it is absolutely essential to your mental health that you not speak to a parent, consider two other options. A, write to the parent. B, tell your mother or father that for the next 6 months or 1 year, you will not contact him or her while you work out your anger. Place a time limit on what seems to the parent to be a living suicide. Finally, consider this. When I saw how my father treated his extremely difficult mother, I understood that I would have obligations toward my parents. When your children see you totally ignore your parent, what precedent are you setting for them? Television and me. How having a national television show helped me understand what matters in life. During 1994-95, my national television show was on 156 stations covering over 80% of America. Of all the people to have their own television show, I must be the most ironic choice. First, I almost never watch television. Second, I have continually urged people to decrease the hours they devote to watching television. But since on any given day about 100 million Americans will be found in front of their TV sets, and since my primary goal in life is to bring my values and ideas to as many people as possible, how could I turn down the opportunity to have a national TV show? As I very quickly realized, however, the question was not whether I would want to do television, it was whether I could do anything good on television and be successful. I say this with sadness. 3 factors militate powerfully against deep programs appearing on commercial television. First, the medium is inherently superficial. Second, programming is solely determined by the bottom line, which in turn is determined only by ratings. Third, there is a lack of serious people watching television, especially daily talk shows. Perhaps nothing summarizes the state of American television and the challenge to anyone wanting to do something worthwhile on TV as does this. Of the more than 100 shows that I recorded, 1 was visually titillating. For about 6 minutes of one show, models from Fredericks of Hollywood modeled scanty lingerie. That show, both times it aired, received the highest ratings of all my shows. As long as advertising revenue is the sole determinant of what is put on commercial television, and as long as advertisers care only about ratings and the bottom line, television will be a medium largely for titillating nonsense. That is why radio is far more capable of supporting sustained thought. The ear can be satisfied by thought, but the eye cannot be. Thoughts do not intrigue the eye. 3 terms come to mind: more action, eye candy, good TV. More action. As anyone in TV can tell you, it is not enough to be very interesting and certainly not enough to be profound. On TV, you must move around, be more animated. When I watched my own show, I found myself more interesting when I was physically more animated, moving my arms, getting up from my seat, making facial expressions. Eye candy. Just as the palate reacts positively to candy and lusts for more of it, the eye too lusts for more tasty input. This is known in television as eye candy. It is vital to keeping viewers lusting for more of your show. A beautiful woman is the most obvious form of eye candy. That is why even television news almost always features a very good-looking woman. And though not as important, TV also features good-looking men as eye candy. Good TV. The aim of television shows is to have as much good TV on the show as possible. Good TV should not, however, be mistaken for anything analogous to good book, or good music, or even good movie. Good TV means either sex or fireworks. On talk TV, fireworks refers to people arguing with preferably shouting at each other. On other TV shows, it will refer to violence. TV has so much sex and violence because they are the easiest, surest ways to produce good TV. Good TV is one of the reasons why TV has so contributed to the coarsening of debate in America. Coarse people with coarse arguments are good television. The destructive remote control. One conclusion that I drew from the lingerie show's high rating is that many people do not actually watch television shows. Rather, they scan the channels with their remote control unit. They are searching for the sexiest or most violent scene, or the most heated argument, or the wildest behavior. The remote control unit has probably contributed as much to the low state of television as the primacy of ratings. To compromise or not to compromise, Mephistopheles and me. Dear reader, what would you do? If your aim was to do something elevating and worthwhile on television, thereby possibly touching millions of lives, would you do some shows with sexy eye candy if such shows could mean the difference between having or not having a show? This was my very painful dilemma, which was exacerbated by additional factors. How can I ever have an impact on those who know nothing of my work if I don't compromise for some good early ratings? What good are values and ideas that are never encountered? Those are the questions that went through my mind, and not only regarding sexual titillation. My producers felt that a fair percentage of my early shows had to be on eye-catching subjects, meaning subjects that I couldn't care less about. For example, would I allow a world championship pool player to hit a billiard ball out of my mouth? I did. Would I do a show on women bodybuilders? I did. In return, I got to do the shows that I cared about. Shows that are not seen on commercial television. I did entire shows arguing for the existence of God, on how parents can raise good children, making the case why men should get married, on why so many Americans are lonely, and many more shows like these. Given these high-level subjects, were my compromises then worth making? First, compromising has a bad name. It suggests the relinquishing of one's integrity for selfish gain. But what if one compromises for an ideal, not for selfish gain? Then the issue becomes trickier. If you never compromise, you may never have the opportunity to achieve a much greater good. But how much compromising can you do before you have sold your soul? If I began getting good ratings based on titillating visuals, could I then stop? As it happened, the compromises that I did make were in the end pointless. With the exception of the lingerie show, none of the other compromises, like the billiard show, rated higher than the shows I wanted to do. By the 4th month of shooting, we had all decided that I would do shows on the subjects that I most cared about, and in the way that I was best suited to presenting them, without guests, interacting with a small, intelligent audience of people who both agreed and disagreed with me. And the ratings began to slowly but steadily rise. The local television station. The problem of low television quality lies in part with local stations. I am certain that given time and a decent hour, my show would succeed. KABC Radio gave me years to earn my audience for what I call thought radio. There is no such amount of time on television. Stations give a show a few months, sometimes a year, to garner good ratings. In that short length of time, a mediocre show with a lot of eye candy has an overwhelming advantage over a far better show that has little eye candy. Conclusions about television. Why then is most American television as bad as it is? 1, because television's appeal is overwhelmingly to the eye, not to the ear and not to the mind. 2, because ratings are all that matter to advertisers and advertising revenue is all that matters to TV stations. 3, because a large number of thoughtful Americans watches very little television, especially talk shows. These facts should make proponents of the market economy, people such as me, acknowledge that capitalism and its market economy come with serious moral challenges. There are a few possible solutions to the dilemma of bad television. 1, we can work on raising the moral, spiritual, and intellectual level of the American people so that they will not watch garbage on television. This, at best, would take decades, and if we did succeed, television would have far fewer viewers. Most people, as they deepen their lives, watch less television, An active and interesting life is far richer and more exciting than almost any television. 2. We can hope that television producers and station heads will decide that they are willing to go with good television over, quote, good TV, unquote, even though it will mean lower ratings for a period of time. 3. If advertisers sponsored programs based on their quality, ratings would cease to be the only decisive concern. This is where companies, often professing to hold traditional values, can put their money where their rhetoric is. Can you imagine the General Electric Geraldo show or Ford Motors presents Jenny Jones? Like everything else in life, television reflects the values of its creators. And when the rewards for not living according to higher values are as enormous as they are in television, vast amounts of money, fame beyond one's wildest imagination, and endless glamour and excitement, choosing values over all of that takes a special type of person. Given its power, television needs producers, talent, sponsors, and station managers who are all special people. And even then, we still have the problem of a coarsened viewing public. Postscript, what I learned. My experience in television land has been a wonderful education for me. First, I returned to the issue of compromise. Compromise, while at times morally necessary or at least justifiable, is more often only the first permission for a person or society to begin a long downhill descent. People can become addicted to fame, money, and attention as deeply as they become addicted to drugs. When a compromise is rewarded, it is as difficult to stop further compromising as it is to stop taking heroin after the first pleasurable heroin experience. If I learned nothing else other than the nature of compromise and the ubiquity of addiction, my sojourn in television has been amply rewarded. What's really important? Virtually every minister, priest, and rabbi tells the same story. They never met a man in his dying days who lamented, "I wish I spent more time at the office." My experience in TV confirmed and further taught me the relative emptiness of so much of what we tend to value. In the case of television, it is fame, money, and glamour. In politics, it is primarily power. In other professions, any of them. Whatever one does for a living, 3 questions need to be confronted before it is too late. What really matters to me? What price do my spouse and kids pay for my career success? What price does my soul pay? Whatever happens with my show, I will always be grateful to Multimedia Entertainment for having forced me at age 46 to answer these questions. The false world of television news. Like millions of other Americans, I was overjoyed several years ago at the successful conclusion to the drama of little Jessica, who had fallen into a dry well. Still, the extensive attention and nationwide anxiety over one girl's fate prompted me to ask, why, with all the horrible sufferings in the world, was so much attention devoted to the suffering of one family in Midland, Texas? One answer, of course, was the inherent drama of the rescue. Another was the joy of seeing many people working heroically to save a little girl. There is an additional answer, however, that does not speak as well about human nature and conduct. Most people do not empathize with other people's suffering unless they actually see it. Between visible and invisible anguish, the visible nearly always wins, even when the invisible suffering is far greater. To regain some balance in the sympathy we apportion to those who suffer, we must become conscious of our natural tendency to care more about the suffering of those whom we see, and consciously sensitize ourselves to concern ourselves with the suffering of those whom we cannot see. One way to begin achieving this is by not watching television news, especially of international events. The more one relies on television for one's perception of the world and its evils, the more skewed one's perceptions of human suffering will be. Television and international news. Television coverage of Palestinian protests during the Intifada provided a good example of the false world of television news. To any television viewer who night after night watched Israeli troops battling with rioting Arabs, the situation appeared morally clear. An occupier was suppressing the occupied. without denying the misery inherent to any occupation, however benign, the situation as seen on television distorted reality more than it illuminated it. Television news has no memory. It wants pictures, not perspective, drama, not understanding. In the words of ABC TV's Ted Koppel, we have substituted facts for knowledge. Thus, the reasons Israel occupied Gaza and the West Bank were of no importance to the nightly network news. That the war which brought about the occupation was thrust upon Israel was simply irrelevant to television news. Television and Western flaws. Another extremely important lesson to learn from the television coverage of Israel and the Palestinians. While TV may report some of the flaws in police states, it can only show the flaws of democratic and near-democratic countries. The greatest evils in the world occur in countries that do not allow Western cameras to report such events. Therefore, almost all the violence that one sees as news on American and Western television takes place in free or relatively free countries. Thus, the violence shown on TV news nearly always takes place in those nations that have the least political violence and repression. Riots in Israel are covered, as are murders in the United States and political violence in South Korea. The power of television news. During an East Coast lecture tour, I became even more aware of TV news's overwhelming influence. I realized that they not only shape viewers' perceptions of events happening far away, but even of those occurring literally in their own backyards. Awakening one morning in New York City, I looked out my window and saw snow falling. Television and radio newscasts led me to believe that I was in the middle of a terrible snowstorm that was virtually paralyzing America's largest city. They repeatedly warned of an emergency situation in the city and told the public to avoid driving unless absolutely necessary. Since I intended to drive all the way to a Philadelphia suburb to deliver a lecture, I feared for my safety. When I walked outside, I found a light snow was falling and about 2 to 3 inches of snow on the ground. I decided to brave the roads. Much to my surprise, getting out of Manhattan was effortless. The New Jersey Turnpike was virtually empty on a Friday afternoon. When I arrived in the Philadelphia suburb of Cherry Hill, New Jersey, I found a city that had reacted to a few inches of snow as if it were next door to the Chernobyl reactor. Many stores were closed and the open ones had few customers. What became apparent in this situation was the media's ability to influence people's perceptions and conduct more than reality itself. People were more affected by what television told them than by what they could see happening right outside their windows. The need for media hype reflects a deep boredom that many Americans evidently feel in their lives. For many Americans, actual life is not exciting enough, and thus they need media excitement, even concerning the weather. Wanting drama and excitement in their own lives, many people lead what may be called television lives. The best solution is for millions of Americans to tear themselves away from television, particularly from television news. Unfortunately, for most people, that is as difficult as it is for an alcoholic to stop drinking. I have nothing against those programs that are the most frequently attacked: sitcoms, quiz shows, soap operas, and the like. Many may be vapid, but they don't take themselves seriously. Their task is not to transmit reality, but to provide entertainment. Hence, they do little harm. Television news provides entertainment, but claims to transmit reality. Hence, it often does real harm. Part 2. Liberalism. What happened to a great ideology? I do not like attacking liberalism for a number of reasons, chief among them being that I long considered myself liberal. I was raised in a liberal Jewish, almost a redundancy, home in which Adlai Stevenson ranked just under religious heroes, in which Democrat, labor, and liberal meant looking out for the little guy, and where Republican, business, and conservative meant selfishness and occasionally even anti-Semitism. These were powerful influences on a child growing up in a middle-class home in Brooklyn, New York in the 1950s. I believe in the separation of church and state, pluralism, open-mindedness, tolerance, personal freedom, fighting for the downtrodden, a higher minimum wage, women's equality, a colorblind society, legal though discouraged abortion, legalized prostitution, and free trade, to cite but a few liberal positions that I hold. Until the late 1960s, this list would have qualified me beyond question as a liberal. Since then, however, liberalism has become identified with positions that were always regarded as left or even radical, but not liberal, and often not even moral. Is the liberal position on abortion liberal or anarchic? It is one thing to argue on behalf of legalized abortions. It is quite another to argue that abortion is nothing more than, quote, a woman controlling her own body, unquote, or labeling abortion, quote, reproductive rights, unquote. Communism has been, with the exception of Nazism, the greatest organized evil in history. Yet liberalism moved so far left that liberals who continued to call themselves and act anti-communist were labeled right-wingers. Indeed, it was the liberal opposition to anti-communism that shocked me into reassessing liberalism. Is the current liberal position on church-state separation liberal or anti-religious? Is the liberal position on looking at America through race-based eyes liberal or racist? In large part due to liberal policies of the past 25 years, large numbers of Americans have become welfare addicts. The American university has declined as it replaced the search of truth with pursuit of an ideological agenda. Criminals receive more compassion than do their unprecedentedly large number of victims. The rate of out-of-wedlock births has risen beyond what anyone could have imagined a generation ago, and the balkanization of one of the few countries in the world not to have a Balkan-like problem has begun. My critiques of liberalism are not arguments on behalf of conservatism. The only ism I care about is ethical monotheism, which I will discuss in a later chapter. Is liberalism Jewish? The United States is facing a struggle for its soul, and if we can characterize this struggle as essentially liberal left secular versus conservative right religious, most Jews have allied themselves with the liberal left secular forces. They believe that liberal positions are morally superior and that these positions are essentially Jewish. I respectfully disagree. Though the liberal impulse is a moral one, and liberalism has played a profoundly positive role in American political life, in the last 30 years it has changed in fundamental ways. These changes are so fundamental that an honest inquiry into Judaism would reveal that many contemporary liberal positions are neither moral nor Jewish. It is with great sadness, therefore, that I have concluded that in the struggle for America's soul, many American Jews have too often taken positions that hurt America. The problem is this: most American Jews do not derive their values from Judaism. They derive their values from the dominant secular liberal culture, and these values are no longer congruent with Judaism, even a non-fundamentalist Judaism. Most Jews believe that all they need to do in order to formulate a Jewish position is, first, note that Judaism teaches compassion. Then, take the liberal position, usually the one that seems to be the most compassionate, and finally, label that position Jewish. To cite one example, when the most liberal of Judaism's denominations, the Reconstructionist movement, voted to marry men to men and women to women, 3,000 years of Jewish teaching that sexuality, that infinitely elastic drive, should be channeled into heterosexual marriage, was discarded. The reason? Compassion for the individual homosexual. When there is a tension between a social value and compassion for the individual, the liberal inclination is to discard the value. But I am not prepared to forsake the heterosexual marital ideal. Compassion versus justice. Jews who know Judaism's love of compassion are entirely right. The Jewish self-perception has always been of a people wanting to be compassionate. The ancient rabbinic description of the Jews is, compassionate ones, the children of compassionate ones. Liberal Jews, however, have done to compassion what many Christians have done to faith, elevated it over all other values. Yes, we are to be compassionate, but the state must first be just. Zion will be redeemed through justice, said the prophet Isaiah, not through compassion. Compassion, by definition, is selective. Thus, when the state is compassionate to blacks because of past racism, it enacts laws that are often unjust to individuals who are not black. In the name of compassion, the American government unfairly spends many more dollars per AIDS patient than per cancer patient. Secular versus religious society. Contemporary liberals seem to believe that the Judeo-Christian tradition upon which America was founded is no longer needed. That is why they passionately work to keep mention of God out of public schools, why they sue the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts for insisting that Scouts take the Scouting Oath, which includes God's name. Of course, all this is done under the banner of concern for separation of church and state. But the result, and for some the agenda, is the removal of religion and God from as much of American life as possible. Unlike secular liberal Jews and their organizations, this Jew fears a post-Christian America. We have seen post-Christianity in Nazism and communism, and I saw what religion-free America might be like a few blocks from my home during the riots in Los Angeles. Those were not Christians who destroyed thousands of innocent people's businesses and who beat people to death or near death for not being black. Many Jews refuse to acknowledge how profoundly Christians, especially in America, have changed for the good, particularly in their attitudes towards Jews, since the days of Christian-inspired anti-Semitism. This is not unique to Jews. Many blacks, too, do not acknowledge the sea change that has taken place in most white people's views of blacks. Because it is difficult to think a second time, it is difficult to stop hating people who once did earn your animosity. Insofar as the welfare of the American Republic and its Jewish population is concerned, the people I most fear are not Christian. They are white and black racists, and to a lesser degree the well-intentioned members of radically secular organizations like the ACLU. The contemporary American campus provides another example of what happens in a wholly secular atmosphere. With its political correctness and speech codes, the secular liberal university has become, as the late Professor Allen Bloom noted, the most closed-minded institution in America today. One reason for the moral and intellectual decline of the university is to be found in the Psalms. Quote, "Wisdom begins with awe of God." When God is removed from society within a generation or two, moral foolishness prevails. Sources of evil, people or forces. One of Judaism's greatest teachings is that the human being knows good from evil and therefore has freedom of moral choice. One of the most dangerous teachings of the left since Marx is that people are not morally free. They do bad things because of outside forces, most especially economic ones. Thus, the belief that poverty causes violent crime has become a credo of liberals. People do bad things to other people because they do not have good values. That is Judaism's greatness, preoccupation with teaching goodness. As it says in Deuteronomy, "And you will teach these things to your children when you sit in your house and when you go on the road and when you lie down and when you arise." The Jewish task is to bring the world to ethical monotheism, not to liberalism and not to conservatism. That is the only reason for our being here as Jews. We have a mission to teach that God, without universal ethical demands, leads to a Khomeini or a crusader, and to teach that ethics without God leads to Nazism and communism and the moral anarchy we are creating in America. If liberal Jews devoted their abilities, efforts, and passions to Judaism and ethical monotheism, as they now do to liberalism, Jews would change America and the world. Indeed, only then would Jews help produce the very type of beautiful world that liberals want. Blacks, liberals, and the Los Angeles riots. To see the midday sky over your city turn black with smoke from fire is frightening. To see this outside your home and to know that the fires were acts not of nature, but set by people intent on burning your city, is more than frightening. It is traumatizing. On Thursday, April 27, 1992, I watched my city burn. I watched the police of my city watch along with me. And I watched my city's and country's media deny that what was happening was evil. I watched all this, and I was traumatized. But not surprised, for the Los Angeles riots only reconfirmed my most deeply held beliefs about what is happening in America, largely because of what happened to liberalism. For generations a moral beacon, one which regarded America as mankind's greatest hope for freedom and democracy, liberalism began in the mid-1960s to view America as an enemy of those precepts. Many liberals came to reject values they had long cherished and sometimes embraced their opposites. Were a liberal who went to sleep in 1960 to awaken in the 1990s, he wouldn't believe how profoundly people and institutions calling themselves liberals had changed, particularly with regard to racial issues. Liberalism in 1960 pushed for a colorblind society. Afterward, it advocated a color-based society and color-based government regulations. Liberalism in 1960 opposed racial quotas. Afterward, it supported them. Liberalism in 1960 regarded society's battle as one between right and wrong. Afterward, it began to see the battle as between blacks and whites, between men and women, and between the rich and the poor. Race, gender, class. In thus reconstituting itself, liberalism has played a major role in the moral and spiritual decline of America, especially black America. Many individuals who identify themselves as liberals do not hold every position cited here. But the influential liberal segments of American society do. The media, academia, the civil rights establishment, and the dominant wing of the Democratic Party. In its attack against the moral credibility of American society, its lowering of moral, intellectual, and professional standards for blacks, and its cultivation of black rage against America, contemporary liberalism contributed significantly to the burning of Los Angeles. Lower moral expectations of blacks. During the riots, I heard a local NBC TV reporter say, here at the corner of, mentioning 2 LA streets, I see 5 black gentlemen throwing stones at cars. Liberalism has so stifled moral honesty in relation to blacks that a reporter instinctively felt it necessary to call black thugs gentlemen. This refusal to call a black thug a thug is the result of the last quarter century of liberal thinking on race. It has become the most pernicious form of racism in America. No Ku Klux Klansman in the past 25 years has done as much to hurt blacks as those liberals, white and black, who have lowered moral standards for blacks. These people condemn white evil, but explain black evil. Blacks are economically deprived, blacks are victims, thus blacks, understandably, have uncontrollable rage. Blacks are enraged. Liberal reactions to the riots often emphasize the need to, quote, understand the rage, unquote, of that minority of blacks who terrorized innocent people and torched nearly 1,000 Los Angeles businesses. For most reporters, academics, politicians, and for the civil rights establishment, blacks who burned and rioted were not criminals, but people enraged by injustice. I wonder if in 1938, after Kristallnacht, when German racists burned Jewish establishments and murdered Jews, there were those who said, we have to understand the rage of these people. They've had to endure the humiliating Versailles Treaty, authoritarian upbringings, and awful economic problems. Did Nazis not have rage? Do Ku Klux Klansmen not have great rage? In fact, is not all evil accompanied by rage? The difference between moral people and immoral people is not that moral people don't have rage. It is that moral people control their rage and immoral people don't. Moral people channel their rage in constructive and moral directions and certainly do not direct it against innocent people. Nearly 2,000 Korean businesses were burned or looted. But through the type of moral inversion that has characterized some contemporary liberal thought, the rage of the burners, not the burned, was the focus of attention. Blacks are poor. Other liberals invoked the more traditional explanation for minority crime, poverty. For contemporary liberals, income disparity, not the moral disparity between criminals and honest people, explains looters. But if this is so, why did the great majority of poor people refrain from looting? And if income disparity explains looting, how do liberals explain the multimillionaires who looted the savings and loans associations? It would seem that liberal doctrines hold that when wealthy whites loot, they are responsible, but when poor non-whites loot, society is responsible. Couldn't it be that looters suffered from value deprivation more than from material deprivation? After all, very few of the looters stole food. Blacks are victims. Another method of excusing evil committed by blacks has been to depict them as victims. This has a terrible moral upshot. Victims are not morally accountable for their actions. Since by definition victims are oppressed, Almost anything they do is a justified response to oppression. Rage, poverty, victimhood. The three liberal excuses for black people who do bad things to good people. Liberalism and the fomenting of black rage. Many black Americans are enraged, but far from absolving liberalism, this leads to the greatest indictment of it, the relentless fomenting of rage against American society among many blacks. It is not surprising that blacks who have been told all their life that white America is racist, that whites have it in for them, and that no matter how hard they try, whites will trample on them, will have some rage. Ironically, however, it is not the oldest blacks who suffered the longest under racist laws who were particularly angry. There must therefore be an additional reason for the most intense black rage. That reason, the absence of fathers, I discuss a little later. Depict America as racist. Liberals have cultivated black anger by A, constantly depicting America as a racist society, B, rewarding blacks who have rage at America, and C, punishing blacks who defend American society against charges of racism. Here are the words of a black liberal author, Walter Mosley, published in the Los Angeles Times on its opinion page less than a week after the riots. America is a brutal land. Its language is violence and bloodshed. That is why Rodney King was beaten. That is why another king was assassinated. To Mosley, as to other liberal spokespeople, it was not one vile racist who murdered Dr. Martin Luther King. It was brutal America. Blame America, not an American. To put this into perspective, can anyone imagine that the Los Angeles Times would publish an article blaming black America for the rape and beating of the Central Park jogger? Of course not, because such an article would be correctly considered racist and therefore not worthy of publication. But black racist writing is published and honored. Writing about the riots, the Jewish liberal writer Leonard Fine made this charge against America. We have as a nation decided to bequeath to our children the rotten fruit of racism and bigotry, decided that it will be for them to choke on it. We must stop now the persistent looting of human life, end the stealing of hopes and the torching of health. Note the moral inversion. Americans in general, not the rioters and arsonists, are the real looters and torturers. At America's leading universities, the pervasiveness of American racism is taken for granted and taught as fact. Liberal depictions of America as racist, oppressive, callous, and greedy could fill volumes. I don't doubt that liberals have good motives, but good motives cause at least as much evil as bad ones. The burning has happened and is likely to happen again in large part because of the reaction of the American media and liberal politicians. Arsonists, we understand your rage. Reward angry blacks, punish those who aren't. For some 25 years, since the day that the late Leonard Bernstein threw a party at his Manhattan penthouse to raise money for the Black Panthers, the liberal elite often has glorified blacks who hate American society and scorned those who love it. The message to blacks who are enraged at America has been clear. The elite of America will honor you, you will appear on the cover of Time, you will get the support of major liberal foundations, and you will get exposure on national television. For you blacks who say that you love this country, there is usually contempt. We will ignore you. If you somehow rise to positions of influence, we will dismiss you as an inauthentic black and try to destroy you. Clarence Thomas provided the classic example. Liberal leaders found intolerable a black man who affirmed Judeo-Christian values, self-sufficiency, the primacy of family, and that America is a land of opportunity. Liberals therefore made every effort to block Thomas's appointment to the Supreme Court. Black hatred for whites. The writings of liberals like Professor Andrew Hacker, author of Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, and Equal, have helped to reinforce black rage at America. Professor Hacker wrote on the opinion page of the Los Angeles Times the week after the riots that whites would like to commit genocide against blacks. About 25% of blacks believe that whites started the AIDS epidemic in order to perpetrate genocide against blacks. At least as many are persuaded that whites are using drugs to commit genocide against blacks. Black leaders attribute any criticism, even legal prosecution of black public figures, no matter how deserved, to white racism. To cite one example, Washington, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry was convicted of narcotics use during a trial in which he was seen acquiring narcotics on a videotape. Nonetheless, the Reverend Jesse Jackson and Benjamin Hooks, then head of the NAACP, among others, blamed Barry's legal problems on white racism. The Rodney King verdict. Liberals believe that the immediate reason for the rage that led to the rioting in Los Angeles was obvious: a jury's acquittal of 3 of the 4 white police officers who beat Rodney King. This belief, shared by most of the world, needs to be analyzed. The media and the video. For over a year, Americans were shown over and over a frightening videotape of white police officers beating a black man. No one who saw the few seconds of the video that were repeatedly shown could imagine an acquittal of any of the officers involved. But those who saw what the news media refused to show and/or watched the entire trial had a far fuller understanding of what happened and why the jury reached its verdict. They saw a 230-pound, 6'3" man acting wildly and lunging at policemen, 4 of whom he actually threw off. The policemen suspected that King was under the influence of the hallucinogenic drug PCP. Like other PCP suspects, he could not be subdued by tasing, the shooting of powerful electric shocks. Only after their verbal orders had been ignored and tasing and other techniques had failed to subdue him did the police use their batons to beat King. And all this was after an 8-mile car chase at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour on a freeway and 80 miles per hour through city streets. It is almost impossible to overstate how responsible the media were for the rage over the Rodney King verdict. Los Angeles and national news programs deliberately and repeatedly showed only the most brutal seconds of the tape, thus never providing viewers with a context. It was as if all that Americans ever saw of the riots were pictures of Korean Americans armed and shooting. The New York Times and other leading newspapers, whenever discussing the incident, always referred to King as the black motorist Rodney King. Had King been described even half the time as, quote, the paroled armed robber who had just eluded police in a 100-mile-per-hour car chase, unquote, passions might not have been nearly as stirred up. Certainly, had news programs shown more of the tape, the incident would never have engendered as much rage as it did. The police. None of this is to say that the police did no wrong. It seems obvious that excessive force was used. Indeed, the jury did not acquit Officer Lawrence Powell, who administered nearly all the blows that struck Rodney King. Nevertheless, since the prosecution sought conviction on much more serious charges than excessive force, the jury was not prepared to render a guilty verdict which would have necessitated severe punishment. Nor do I deny for a moment that there is police brutality in America or that there are racist police officers. But anyone who has seen tapes of brutal police treatment of, for example, anti-abortion demonstrators, nearly all of whom are white and conservative, would find it difficult to believe that police brutality is exclusively a racial issue. Moreover, if racism rather than Rodney King's violent behavior caused the police officers' beating of him, why did the officers do virtually nothing to King's 2 black companions who obeyed police instructions? The charge of racism in the Rodney King case was probably a smear in the case of at least one of the officers involved, Stacy Kuhn. A few months prior to the King beating, Officer Kuhn, to the amazement of onlookers, applied mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to a dying black transvestite prostitute who had open sores on his mouth. Why didn't we hear about this on local and national newscasts? I am well aware from the experiences of black friends that police sometimes stop blacks for no other reason than they are black. In general, however, the facts of life conflict with what we might want them to be. When black males are disproportionately involved in violent crime, it is as inevitable as it is tragic that innocent black men will be disproportionately suspect. That is not always racism. It is always a tragedy. What must be demanded of a policeman is civil behavior when he stops a black person for questioning, and sincere apologies and explanations when he realizes that he has questioned an innocent person. Liberals and the verdict. Given both how little the public was shown of the videotape and the small number of people who watched the entire trial, most people drew one of 2 possible conclusions. 1, the jury was composed of 12 racists and/or fools, or 2, in the course of a half a year, the jury saw and learned far more than we did from a few seconds of carefully chosen video. Liberal media, politicians, and organizations, without an exception of which I am aware, all espoused conclusion number 1. The most obvious reason is that liberals, like all decent people, were repulsed by the few seconds of the video which they saw. But that cannot be the only reason. Why the extraordinary rage over a verdict that involved police hitting a convicted felon who was driving intoxicated and speeding from police at 100 miles per hour and who wasn't maimed, let alone killed? The answer is obvious. Rodney King is black and the police officers are white. For liberals, the Rodney King verdict was, or could be depicted as, further proof that most white Americans are racist. Take any 12 whites, the argument went, and look at the results. Racists who acquit cops for mercilessly beating an innocent black man. The consequences of liberal condemnation of the jury. America will suffer from the widespread liberal condemnation of the, quote, white racist jury, unquote. First, it is difficult to imagine that many people will willingly sit in judgment in politically sensitive criminal cases, or if they do, that they will render verdicts that black activists and liberals do not want. Second, liberals made it respectable to try people via 10-second TV sound bites. Third, by unleashing torrents of outrage at the verdict while explaining the rage of the rioters, liberals have assured future riots at unpopular verdicts, even at verdicts with which most liberals might concur. Rage at the verdict. It is demeaning to blacks, hence racist, to hold that it is understandable that they would burn and loot out of rage over a verdict that strongly offended them. It is important to note, by the way, that more Latinos than blacks were arrested for looting, further proof that the motives of the looters was thievery, not rage. The number of trials in America in which violent criminals are acquitted or given absurdly light sentences is mind-boggling. Many of us are enraged at America's criminal justice system for its lenient treatment of evil people. Moreover, there are at least as many verdicts in this country that unfairly favor black defendants who have hurt whites as white defendants who have hurt blacks. According to those who justify rage over bad verdicts, whites ought to have as much justification for rioting. Every liberal whose reaction to the Los Angeles riots was to understand the rage of black rioters rather than to condemn the rioting has sent 2 messages to the vast majority of blacks who, enraged or not, hurt no one. 1, we expect little from blacks. 2, we understand why blacks would torch buildings and beat whites, and we don't understand why you didn't. Perhaps you weren't enraged enough. The roots of black rage. Ask enraged blacks or liberals why many blacks are angry, and they will tell you that it is because of endemic white racism and the legacy of slavery and segregation. I would like to offer 2 additional reasons which I have learned from non-enraged blacks: the lack of fathers and the patronizing attitude implied by racial quotas. I suspect that black males are angry primarily because they were abandoned by their fathers, not because of white racism. Given that 60 to 70% of black boys grow up without fathers present as moral models and disciplinarians, rage and violence are not surprising. But instead of focusing on the absence of black men to serve as fathers and role models, white and black liberals have focused on white racism. They have labeled racist those whites who, as Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan did in 1964, described the breakdown of the black family as the greatest problem facing black America. Indeed, the attacks on Moynihan were so intense that the subject of black illegitimate births became taboo for more than 20 years. And they have vented their greatest fury on those blacks who have pointed to the same problem. Liberals also have contributed to a second source of anger, a diminished sense of self-worth through affirmative action and racial quotas. The sense of inferiority that this instills in many blacks has been eloquently described by Professor Shelby Steele, the black author of The Content of Our Character. Quote, "One of the most troubling effects of racial preferences for blacks is a kind of demoralization. Under affirmative action, the quality that earns us preferential treatment is an implied inferiority." Unquote. No wonder so many black college students are seething with rage. So would I if I thought that nearly everyone around me saw me as inferior. Race matters more than values. The lowering of moral expectations of blacks is an outgrowth of other liberal attitudes. One is moral relativism, which is advanced these days as multiculturalism. The other is the belief that society is not composed of individuals, but of racial, sexual, and economic groups. These two dangerous ideas are closely related. Judeo-Christian civilization has been dominated by trinities. In Christianity, it is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. In Judaism, it is God, Torah, and Israel. For the left and many liberal intellectuals today, it is race, gender, and class. This reductionist way of perceiving human distinctions is at the heart of the culture war that is engulfing America. Will America continue to believe, as Judaism and Christianity have taught, that there is one universal morality for all people emanating from a source higher than human beings? Or will it adopt the view that moral rules emanate from gender, race, and economic class? The idea that race, gender, and class, rather than one's behavior and values, are what divide people, provides the intellectual justification for not holding blacks accountable to the same moral standards as whites. Whereas liberals used to believe that there are good and bad ways to think, the dominant liberal belief today is that there are white and black ways to think. The secularization of society. Liberalism also contributed to the Los Angeles riots because of its relentless attempts, both philosophical and political, to secularize society. To the best of my knowledge, no church-going black torched any buildings or beat anyone in the LA riots. And the centers of black resistance to rioting were the churches in South Central Los Angeles. Moreover, 3 of the 4 black heroes who rescued Reginald Denny identified themselves as Christians. Liberal activists yearn for a post-Christian America. But this Jew believes that in the Los Angeles riots, we saw a preview of precisely what such an America would look like. What is to be done? Neither Republicans nor Democrats can be proud of their record vis-a-vis blacks. Republicans ignore, and Democrats infantilize them. In recent years, the Republican attitude has been less harmful, but not praiseworthy. We need solutions without partisanship. Here are some brief suggestions. Honesty. The greatest problems in black life, as in Jewish life, white life, and American life in general, are internal. In the case of blacks, this is so self-evident that it takes no insight, only courage to acknowledge it. Every day that a black or white liberal leader focuses on white racism is another day lost in the battle to rescue the large number of dysfunctional black males. End racial quotas. Legally binding affirmative action, racial quotas, and race norming must end. They demean every black accomplishment. Universal draft. The United States should institute a universal draft of young men. This will give society a chance to inculcate social and ethical values in every young black and white male, lessen drug and other criminal activities that involve so many young males, force young blacks and whites to work together, teach trades to those without employable skills. Draftees can choose among a number of possible services, military or civilian. Ethical monotheism instead of ethical relativism. A front-page article in the Los Angeles Times on black attitudes towards the 4 black men who beat and almost murdered white truck driver Reginald Denny was headlined, "Denny suspects are thugs to some, heroes to others." The article begins, "Depending on who you ask, they are either vicious gang members who deserve to spend the rest of their lives behind bars, revolutionary soldiers who sounded the first shots of a racial insurrection, or decent young men who are falsely accused." The article implied that it is entirely a matter of opinion. Some people deem it heroic to beat an innocent human being unconscious, and others deem it wrong. This is part of the harvest we are reaping from multiculturalism. In theory, multiculturalism is something we should all celebrate. Unfortunately, in practice, multiculturalism means multi-morality. The only antidote to such nihilistic thinking is ethical monotheism, the belief in one universal code of ethics. Different cultures glorify humanity, but different moralities destroy it. We must teach what Professor Viktor Frankl concluded after surviving Auschwitz, the Nazi death camp. There are only two races of human beings, the decent and the indecent. That is how the world is divided, not between rich and poor, men and women, north and south, black and white, the powerful and the powerless, or any other non-moral division that too many contemporary liberals have been advocating. Epilogue: Body Blows to America. There has been, I believe, a profound naivete on the part of liberals with regard to civilization. As a Jew, I am particularly aware of the fragility of civilization. I know that the people who gave us Bach, Beethoven, and Schiller also gave us Auschwitz. No matter how highly developed a civilization may be, there is always a thin line dividing it from the possibilities of an Auschwitz or a Gulag archipelago. Those who do not recognize this fragility think that they can constantly attack the moral credibility of a decent society without weakening it. But there is just so much beating that American society and institutions can take. There are just so many times that the elite of a society can declare that it is racist, sexist, oppressive, and that it wishes to commit genocide against one of its races. And it can survive just so many excuses for the evil behavior of barbarians within it. America has taken a body blow. The smoke rising near my home made me aware of that. For the first time in my life, I feared for this country. The tragedy and the irony is that many of the people delivering these blows to the greatest, most liberal democracy in history are often called liberals. The struggle for America's soul. Thoughts on calling America racist. All Americans should see the film Gettysburg. It tells the story of the battle that cost the most lives in the Civil War. I looked up how many Union soldiers were killed in the Civil War, not because the Confederacy's losses were not tragic, but because I agree with the values for which the Union was fighting, specifically the abolition of slavery. The number killed on the Union side was 360,000. 360,000 Americans died in order to free 4 million slaves. This is an impressive figure. I cite this figure because there is a need for Americans of all races to be aware of a fact that is not politically correct to note. Many white Americans were killed or maimed in order to end slavery. If there is an afterlife, I would like those who blanketly label the country racist since its founding to be prepared to make this charge when they meet those young Americans who were slaughtered in order to end slavery. I am increasingly impatient with the libel that America is racist. Yes, there are racists in America, of all colors I might add, and racism is the most despicable belief a human being can hold. But knowledge of history should restrain one from making unfair generalizations. Many of the soldiers volunteered and were prepared to die for the Union because they believed first and foremost that slavery was wrong. These men also believed that America had fashioned an entirely new view of humanity, namely, that who you are is more important than who your father was. This was an utterly novel idea in a world in which family background and ethnicity had always been more important than the individual. This has been the great American challenge, to consider the individual, not the group, as primary. But it would seem that this American ideal hasn't been passed on successfully to many in our generation. Unlike other countries, the United States is more an idea than a place, ethnicity, or race. Unfortunately, most American young people today cannot answer what is America for, what is it about, why was it founded, why is it different. They can't answer these questions because they haven't been taught an answer. Our public schools no longer teach what makes America distinctive. They have a Gay Pride Month in the Los Angeles Unified School District, but they don't have an American Pride Month. It's well and good that we all have pride in our particular group, symbolized by St. Patrick's Day, Salute to Israel Day, Black Pride Month. But if we're only a collection of diverse groups, then America is no longer an idea, only a geographical entity. That is what multiculturalism has become, a denial of Americanness and of the American idea. This frightens me, because the older I get, the more I appreciate how unique America and the American idea are. Psychology and the denial of evil. If asked what aspect of reality most people deny, most of us probably would respond, death. I am convinced that there is a reality as significant as death that is even more widely denied, evil, particularly the realization that evil emanates from within human beings. Attempts to ascribe evil to sources outside of human beings can be found in almost every culture. In the Western world, Christianity has often blamed evil on the devil or on the original sin of Adam and Eve. But rooted as Christianity is in Judaism, which ascribes evil overwhelmingly to human nature, Western civilization has generally accepted that there are evil people and that they are responsible for their evil behavior. However, in the 18th century, when religion began to lose its influence, the belief that people are responsible for the evil they commit also began to wane. To this day, virtually every worldview rooted in a secular outlook denies that evil emanates from human nature. Marxism, until recently the most influential secular idea, is based upon the rejection of man as the source of evil. Evil, Marx and Engels taught, is caused by socio-economic forces, not by human nature. The common thread running through most secular ideologies has been the focus on forces outside of man as the sources of evil. The list of forces is nearly endless: nationalism, religion, money, television, weapons, corruption, and government. In our time, there has been a two-pronged attack on the belief in evil's very existence. The first was moral relativism. As historian Paul Johnson has noted, the West has applied Einstein's theory of relativity in physics to good and evil, creating moral relativism, a particularly sad irony given that Einstein himself strongly affirmed universal standards of morality. The second attack often emanates from the world of psychology. Although psychology has invaluable insights and is capable of massively helping humanity, it is now commonly used to deny evil. Good has been replaced by healthy, and evil by sick. This is wrong. First, acts of violence can sometimes be moral and psychologically healthy. A woman who uses necessary violence to stop an abusive husband is engaged in a considerably healthier response than a woman who submits to repeated violence. Second, violence that is immoral is not necessarily psychopathological. As incredible as it may sound, it is quite possible to murder or rape and not be sick. It is time to announce loudly, clearly, and repeatedly that such acts may be normal, but evil. Why should we think that murder is necessarily sick? Is it sick for a criminal to murder a witness to his crime? Or is it simply evil? And why is rape necessarily sick? Polls of male college students have revealed that about half of them could see themselves forcing a woman on a date to have sex if they were certain that they would not be punished. Is the implication then that about half of America's college men are sick? Finally, why is good behavior necessarily psychologically normal? Was a non-Jew who risked his life to save a Jew during the Holocaust acting normally? Such an action was certainly noble, but by what criterion was this behavior normal? Evil behavior in some is not necessarily sick. Until we face the uncomfortable reality that evil stems far more from within our nature than from forces outside of us or from psychopathology, there is no hope for making a better world. Capital punishment, a Rorschach test. In America today, I believe that opposition to the death penalty reveals more about people than their views on almost any other contentious issue. When two individuals differ about abortion, their positions do not necessarily reflect anything more than their differing understanding of when life begins. So too, opinions about welfare, gay rights, national health insurance, and a host of other controversial issues may reveal little more than individual views on those particular issues. But I believe that opposition to capital punishment is revealing. With regard to almost every other controversial issue, I am able to understand and even empathize with people with whom I disagree. But a person who believes that putting Adolf Eichmann or Charles Manson to death is an immoral act thinks so differently from those of us who support the death penalty for murderers that the philosophical gulf between us may be unbridgeable. The belief that every person who premeditatedly murders another deserves to live seems to me so unjust, so cruel to the victim and to those who loved him or her, and such a denial of the decent human instinct of just retribution that this position needs to be analyzed as much as it needs to be refuted. I am convinced, nevertheless, that when the case for capital punishment is articulately made, its appeal to logic, morality, and our highest emotions will be convincing to most people, including some who now oppose the death penalty. I conclude by explaining why I believe that most opponents are motivated by reasons unrelated to capital punishment, and why opposition to capital punishment is often a Rorschach test revealing a person's other values and attitudes. Arguments for capital punishment. It is the only just response to murder. I assume that nearly all people would deem it terribly unfair if I were to steal my neighbor's car and be allowed to go on using my car while he is deprived of his. Why does this fundamental tenet of fairness not hold true concerning life? On grounds of justice and fairness alone, why should I be allowed to keep my life after I have deliberately taken someone else's away? Consider only the issue of what is deserved. Do opponents of capital punishment believe that all murderers deserve to go on living? Do they really feel that Adolf Eichmann, Idi Amin, and the Hillside Strangler deserve to live out their days? Opponents of capital punishment might respond that many such murderers truly do not deserve to continue living, but capital punishment is still wrong for a host of other reasons. I will address each of those reasons. For now, all I ask is that opponents of capital punishment acknowledge the injustice of allowing those who rob others of life to retain their own. It is the only compassionate response to murder. In the large majority of instances, relatives and friends of murder victims suffer enduring and terrible pain, knowing that the murderer of their loved one continues to live. Were a family member or friend murdered, the thought that his or her killer would be allowed to live out his days, in prison or even worse, as a free man on parole, would cause me terrible and permanent pain. And if I were the victim and could speak from my premature grave, I would cry out for my killer's death. I am filled with anger at the thought that although I could never again see my children, be with my wife, see a sunrise, read a book, or talk with my friends, my murderer could do every one of these things. Compassion, as much as justice, dictates the death penalty for murder. The only way to declare murder evil. Society expresses its attitude toward any crime solely by the punishment it metes out. A society such as ours that generally punishes murder with a few years in prison does not deem murder particularly terrible. Imprisonment for murder declares murder a lesser evil than does the death penalty. It may deter other murders. Most of us who support the death penalty do so for reasons having little or nothing to do with its deterrent value. If it were proven that capital punishment didn't deter a single murder, I would still be passionately pro-capital punishment. But of course such proof is impossible. Some people will murder even when there is a death penalty, but this in no way answers the question of whether the death penalty deters anyone. It only demonstrates that it doesn't deter everyone. Since by definition deterrence is not perfectly measurable, it is impossible to precisely measure what people would do, we have to use common sense, just as we do with regard to prison terms. Whether or not there are data to prove that long prison terms deter more than short prison terms, no one assumes that long prison terms are useless in terms of deterrence. Doesn't common sense suggest, therefore, that if the death penalty were given to most murderers, this might deter some people from murdering? Isn't it absurd to assume that long prison sentences deter some criminals, but that the death penalty doesn't? The Bible unambiguously demands it. That the Bible unambiguously demands the death penalty for murder may be irrelevant to secular opponents of capital punishment. But to those who claim to hold the Bible sacred, its passion on this subject ought to be relevant. It is therefore surprising that there are many religious people who oppose the death penalty, often in the name of religion. Religious Jews or Christians who oppose capital punishment should be able to say forthrightly, while the Bible demands the execution of premeditated murderers, I believe that this position is no longer valid. What that person should not do is claim that a position that is diametrically opposed to the Bible is rooted in it. Very few commandments in the Torah are demanded of all people, not only of Jews. One of these few is the death penalty for murderers. The commandment to put murderers to death is listed in Genesis prior to the existence of the Jews. Quote, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for in his image did God create humankind." Unquote. Indeed, the Hebrew Bible considers capital punishment so essential to creating civilized society that it is the second commandment God gives to mankind. The first is to be fruitful and multiply. So important is capital punishment for murder that it is listed in all 5 books of the Torah. It is the only law in the Torah repeated in each of its books. Exodus 21:12 says, "He who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death." Leviticus 24:17 says, "If anyone slays a human being, he shall be put to death." Numbers 35:31, "And you shall not take reparation for the soul of a murderer who deserves to die, but he shall be put to death." This verse makes it clear that a life for a life, unlike an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, is meant literally. All other crimes are compensable by monetary payments. Deuteronomy 19:20 adds the commonsensical notion that the death penalty is necessary, quote, "so that people shall hear and be afraid," unquote. Twice it appends, quote, "and you shall burn out the evil from your midst," unquote, to its demands for capital punishment. As the quintessential doer of evil, the murderer cannot be allowed to continue to live in your midst. Arguments against capital punishment. An innocent person may be executed. That an innocent person may be executed is the one moral argument against capital punishment. Nonetheless, the remote possibility of an innocent person's execution does not invalidate the death penalty. For one thing, judicial and technological safeguards, for example DNA testing, could be erected so as to make this all but impossible. But even with the best of safeguards, an innocent person might still be executed, and that is a horror. Still, far more innocent people will be murdered if there is no death penalty than if there is. Murderers who would not have been executed will murder other prisoners and prison guards, or they will escape or be released on parole and murder civilians outside of prison. Our choice is clear. Either the remote possibility of an innocent person being executed if there is a death penalty, or the certainty of many more innocents murdered without a death penalty. Nothing is risk-free. The issue is, can we minimize the risk so it becomes almost non-existent? The argument that an innocent person may be executed is the argument opponents most often offer because it is in fact the one moral argument against capital punishment, and because of that it appeals to people who are otherwise for executing murderers. Yet opponents of the death penalty are opposed to executing a murderer even when his guilt is indisputable, such as a Charles Manson or an Adolf Eichmann. They use the argument that an innocent might be executed because of its debating value. In fact, opponents oppose capital punishment because they think it is wrong to kill murderers, period. The death penalty doesn't accomplish anything. The dead person cannot be brought back to life. The first part of this argument isn't true, and the second mocks the intent of capital punishment. No one believes that capital punishment brings the dead back to life, although even if it did, I wonder how many abolitionists would come to favor the death penalty. But while it cannot revive the dead, capital punishment does revive the spirit of the dead person's loved ones. So long as a murderer lives, there can be no closure, and until there is closure, healing cannot begin. Capital punishment is state murder. As William F. Buckley Jr. has argued, if capital punishment is state murder, then imprisonment is state kidnapping. Many opponents of capital punishment claim not to grasp the moral distinction between the murder of an innocent person and the execution of a murderer. This reductionist mode of thinking, that the two are morally equivalent, has come to dominate opposition to capital punishment. Thus, the head of Amnesty International USA has called the U.S. a serial killer because it executes murderers. To put it succinctly, this claim that the murder of an innocent and the execution of his murderer are morally equivalent because they both involve taking a life is as morally perverse as a claim that rape and lovemaking are morally equivalent because both involve sexual intercourse. Capital punishment doesn't deter. This is probably not true. Statistics are inconclusive, and only if there were a prolonged, fair, speedy, and widespread use of capital punishment would we be in a position to assess whether it does deter. In the meantime, we have to use common sense, which strongly suggests that the death penalty does deter. Since other punishments deter other crimes, why wouldn't capital punishment deter murder? Capital punishment is simply societal revenge. The oft-repeated labeling of capital punishment as revenge is an emotional appeal to all those who consider revenge a dirty word. But the argument is only that, emotional. All punishments have an element of revenge. What is life imprisonment for murder if not partially revenge? Are we really protecting society when we keep in prison a 70-year-old man who committed a murder 45 years earlier? Isn't this revenge? There are two types of revenge, just and unjust. Just revenge is punishment. Unjust revenge, for example, the death penalty for robbery, is what is usually meant when we speak of revenge. The human predilection for unjust revenge must not be allowed to express itself. That is evil. But the human desire to see that the hurt a person has deliberately inflicted upon another person be returned to him only reflects a good and healthy desire for justice. Blacks are disproportionately executed. This argument is not true. Murderers who are poor are disproportionately executed because expensive lawyers are better at manipulating the judicial process. But while we would want wealthy murderers also executed, the argument that poor murderers are disproportionately executed is irrelevant to the question of whether capital punishment should be retained. If a punishment is unequally meted out, the solution is to mete out the punishment equally, not to drop it. Murderers from all racial, ethnic, and economic backgrounds should be equally liable to capital punishment. As Ernest Vandenhage, America's most eloquent defender of the death sentence, writes, "Unequal justice is preferable to equal injustice." If we executed most murderers, there would be a bloodbath. There already is a bloodbath in America, except that almost all the blood is of innocent people. Other Western societies do not have capital punishment. In the United States, to cite just one example, more black Americans are murdered in any 2-year period than died during the 10 years of the Vietnam War. There is a war taking place in American society, which is not the case in the other Western democracies, but only the evil side is allowed to kill. If there were murder on a scale such as America's in other Western countries, they too would have capital punishment. Problems unique to a specific society call for unique approaches. Conclusion. The death penalty as Rorschach test. I began this chapter by calling one's attitude toward capital punishment a Rorschach test. The stronger one's opposition to the death penalty, the more that says about a person's stances on some of life's most fundamental questions. I do not mean this as an ad hominem attack on all opponents of capital punishment. Some very fine people oppose capital punishment. Yet, if all I know about a person is that he or she actively opposes the death penalty, I am hesitant to trust the person's judgment on other moral issues, because the real reasons for opposition to capital punishment rarely are the ones offered. Ernest Vandenhage notes that in debate with America's leading opponents of the death penalty, all of them, quote, admitted that if they had the choice, they would rather see 500 innocents murdered than execute one convict found guilty of murder. This incredible admission further proves that the arguments offered by most opponents of capital punishment are rarely the real reasons for their opposition. What then are those reasons? I believe that it has to do with one's ability to recognize evil and to confront it. The wish to deny that people are the primary cause of evil and that some people are evil might be the strongest denial mechanism operating in the world today. This denial of evil accounts for another major belief of most opponents of capital punishment, the moral equation of capital punishment with murder. This doctrine of moral equivalence, whether of the United States and the Soviet Union, Western values and all other value systems, or of murder and capital punishment, is the contemporary expression of the denial of evil. Nothing is morally better or worse. No one is morally better or worse, except those who believe that some people are morally worse. One terrible consequence of not hating and confronting evil is that those who refuse to do so often end up confronting and hating those who do fight evil. Whether they intend it or not, activists against capital punishment direct their compassion toward those who commit the greatest evil man can commit. And that misdirected compassion inevitably expresses itself in misdirected cruelty toward society at large, and especially toward the bereaved who yearn to see justice done. Idealists can be very dangerous. Murder in the name of God. It has been easy to lose sight of the most important and frightening aspects of the late Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's 1989 call to Muslims to murder Salman Rushdie for writing the Satanic Verses. First, a renowned religious leader called for the murder of a man who had neither committed nor incited any violence. Second, a religious leader offered $1 million to anyone who would commit murder. Third, despite this call to murder and its offer of a payment, millions of Muslims have agreed with it. The issue is murder, not Muslims' feelings. The call to murder a man must overshadow the hurt feelings of many Muslims, because actions are far more important to God, and should be to people, than feelings. This is not to say that Muslims' feelings are not important, only that murdering writers is considerably more important. Had Khomeini not made the death threat and had Muslims vented their anger at the Rushdie book in a non-violent manner, I and millions of other non-Muslims would have listened sympathetically to their anger and pain. But the moral problem of Muslims' sense of outrage must pale in comparison to the moral problem presented by the Khomeini death threat. The death threat threatens three of our most precious values: freedom to write anything that does not incite violence, the abolition of the death penalty for all offenses except murder, and the dispensing of punishment only after a fair trial. Muslim reactions. Well-meaning Jews, Christians, and Muslims who have focused on Muslim pain and rage rather than on the death threat contend that the threat represents only Khomeini and a small minority of Muslims. I pray that this is so, but based on the Muslim responses that I read, on the numerous calls that I received at the time on my radio talk show, and a dialogue I held with a prominent moderate Muslim leader, I was forced to conclude that many Muslims, even among those living in the tolerant West, agreed with the Ayatollah Khomeini's call to murder Salman Rushdie, and that many more do not particularly disagree. One conclusion, however, seems inescapable. Either there are relatively few moderate Muslim believers, or they are numerous, which I believe, but are very afraid of antagonizing their violence-prone co-religionists. Neither scenario is comforting. Christian and Jewish reactions. The relative lack of response among Christian and Jewish religious leaders to the Khomeini death threat was also discouraging for those of us who look to religion for moral guidance. Religious people need to condemn religious evil in order to maintain their moral credibility. Interestingly, though unfortunately not surprisingly, those Christian leaders who condemned the death threat tended to be religious conservatives. As the New York Times reported, quote, liberals appeared less inclined to give unqualified rejection of the Muslim reaction than were more conservative Christians, unquote. Harvey Cox, the liberal Harvard theologian, suggested that writers who protested the Khomeini death threat, quote, don't really seem to engage the actual hurt and rage of the Muslim people, unquote. On the other hand, conservative Richard Land, executive director of the Southern Baptist Christian Life Commission, quote, repeatedly said he was appalled by this savage attempt to attack the First Amendment rights of American citizens and by the abject cowardice of the booksellers who had stopped selling the book. Cox, the liberal, focused on Muslims' feelings. The conservative focused on the threat to a man's freedom to live and write. The first spoke as a social worker, the second as if he were guarding Western values. He was. Salman Rushdie. The positions expressed here in no way imply admiration for Salman Rushdie. He is no moral hero, no latter-day Thomas More. In fact, Rushdie is somewhat of a moral idiot. He had a long record of praise for third world leftist dictators and for those such as the Irish Republican Army who terrorized democracies. But contempt for Rushdie cannot be an issue here. His right to live and to write is the issue. A war is taking place between Western values and the anti-Western elements within fundamentalist Islam. The price paid to protect Rushdie is minor in comparison to that we'll have to pay if we don't protect him and fight his would-be murderers. It is sad that many people in the Western world have not understood this. Ethical monotheism vindicated. The Iranian cleric's use of God and religion for evil dramatically underscores the need for ethical monotheism. That message, first proclaimed in the Hebrew Bible, is that belief in God and acting ethically must be inextricably linked, that God demands right behavior more than anything else, including right ritual and right belief, and that faith in a universal God without universal ethical standards is a false faith. Belief in God without belief in the primacy and universality of ethics leads to murder in the name of God, from the Crusades to the Khomeini Edict. The Ayatollah Khomeini may have been a monotheist, but he was not an ethical monotheist, not only because he was unethical, but because he believed that God judges people by their beliefs rather than by their ethical treatment of others. According to Khomeini and the millions who agreed with him, God is offended more by a novel that treats Muslim beliefs lightly than he is by the murder of the novelist. For all those who believe that faith in God ensures goodness, the Khomeini episode provides an important lesson in the necessity of ethical monotheism. When religion makes people cruel. I have devoted much of my life to making the case for religion and God-based ethics, but I have never for a moment denied the existence of bad religious people or the ability of religion to be used for evil. I would now like to go one step further. The problem of religious evil exists not only because there are bad religious people and not only because religion can be used for evil. Unfortunately, religion itself can be a source of cruelty. There are doctrines in every religion that, if unchanged or followed literally, make some people meaner than if they had not been religious. I will give examples from the three monotheistic faiths. Islam. Kind and good Muslims have to confront their religion's insistence that the only true Islam is a theocracy, that is, a state governed solely by Muslim law. My Muslim friends who loathe the terror, cruelty, and totalitarianism of Muslim governments in Iran and the Sudan, and who are unhappy with the lack of freedom, suppression of non-Islamic faiths, and oppression of women in Saudi Arabia, continue to yearn for a state ruled entirely by the Sharia, Muslim law, for that is what their religion teaches them. Yet a state ruled by Muslim religious law enforced by its police must by definition be non-democratic and persecute those who believe, quote, incorrectly, unquote. To cite a few of many examples, punishing a Muslim who drinks liquor in his own home, punishing a Muslim woman who doesn't dress according to Islamic law, and putting to death any Muslim who forsakes Islam for another religion. To those of us who believe in personal freedom, these are examples of religion causing people to act cruelly. Judaism. Many Orthodox Jews yearn for a state ruled by halakha, Jewish law, just as Orthodox Muslims yearn for an Islamic state. But such a state, if it ever came into being, would cause many otherwise fine, observant Jews to become cruel, freedom-denying human beings. The late Rabbi Meir Kahane introduced a bill in the Israeli parliament calling for the state's implementation of such halachic rules as imprisonment for any Jew who engaged in sexual relations with a non-Jew. The non-Jew was to receive an even longer prison sentence. The banning of mixed religion beaches, and many other laws that would destroy democracy and radically curtail personal freedom. Some right-wing Orthodox rabbis and laymen, not all I hasten to add, have told me in private that they would not save a non-Jew's life on the Sabbath if it meant violating the Sabbath, unless they add if it were known that they refused to intervene because that would lead to giving Judaism a bad name and to Jew hatred. Were it not for this halakha, these Jews would do what their values and human instinct called for, saving the non-Jewish person. Arguments that these rabbis and lay people are incorrectly citing the halakha are disingenuous. They are citing the halakha. There may be more than one way of interpreting this halakha, but their way is not necessarily halachically wrong. It is morally wrong. It is very sad for me personally to note the ability of Judaism to engender cruelty, because I have always identified Judaism with kindness, and I continue to do so. But there are some beliefs and practices that can make a Jew less noble. The great Rabbi, the Gaon of Vilna, correctly observed that the Torah is like rain. It gives growth to both poisonous weeds and beautiful flowers. Christianity. Historically, the greatest evidence of the ability of religion to make a person cruel can be found among believing Christians. Christian treatment of non-Christians was often evil. For example, otherwise law-abiding people could tolerate or even participate in atrocities against Jews because the Christian Bible blamed Jews for killing Jesus. To non-Christians, the most obvious way in which Christianity can make a Christian less kind is the belief that all non-Christians, no matter how moral and kind, will suffer eternal torment, while all believers in Jesus Christ, no matter what their behavior, will have eternal salvation. I have never been particularly distressed by this belief because I know many kind Christians who hold this belief, and I measure people by their behavior, not by their theology. Nevertheless, to the extent that beliefs do shape behavior, the belief that all the goodness of a non-Christian does not add up to a hill of beans in God's eyes must inevitably minimize the importance of goodness to many devout Christians. All religions. There is another way that religion can provoke cruelty. When religion becomes obsessed with sexual matters, it inevitably conveys the message to many of its adherents that God cares more about premarital sex or women covering their hair or masturbation or pornography than about anything else, even murder. I draw the following conclusions from the realization that religion can cause a diminution in an adherent's goodness. 1. Ethical monotheism is the only antidote to religion causing evil. The central teaching of all faiths must be that God's primary demand is that we be good people. 2. The separation of religion and government is a moral necessity. The ideal is a secular government and a religious population. 3. Each religion needs a reformation, forcing the religion to make peace with and craft a productive religious response to secular governmental authority. 4. The Achilles heel of the three monotheistic faiths is their attitude toward those within and outside of their faith who believe differently. Some classic Jewish attitudes towards non-Jews, Christian attitudes towards non-Christians, and Muslim attitudes towards non-Muslims need to be rejected. 5. Finally, the Gaon of Vilna was right. Religion is like rain. It does bring forth both beautiful flowers and poisonous weeds. 2 lessons are to be learned from this. The lesson for the religious is that they must only plant beautiful flowers. Religion will make people good only if they want it to. The lesson for the non-religious is that since religion is like rain, we cannot live without it. There is no exclusively secular route to a good world. The immorality of pacifist thinking. Since the 1960s, pacifist doctrines, once associated with isolated individuals and religious fringe groups, have become quite popular. Although few refer to themselves as pacifist, anti-war, peace activist, and nonviolent are among the preferred self-descriptions, millions of people living in democracies have in fact come to sympathize with a doctrine that would lead to widespread cruelty and the triumph of evil. If during the Nazi era, democratic societies had practiced pacifism and nonviolence, democracy and human rights would have disappeared, the Jews of the world would have been annihilated, and far more than the 55 million killed in World War II would have been killed. Yet despite all this, the pacifist belief that killing, war, and violence are always immoral has spread throughout the Western world. To begin with religious examples, during the Cold War against communist tyranny, the Presbyterian Church, the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, the United Methodist Church, and the Episcopal Church all made, quote, peace, unquote, their priority program. By peace, such groups meant anything from unilateral disarmament to outright pacifism. Catholic leaders, too, moved in that direction. The National Catholic Educational Association has made peace, read disarmament, nonviolence, anti-nuclear arms, a cornerstone of Catholic education. Outside of religion, there are many indicators of growing sympathy with pacifist thinking. They include the many journalists, politicians, and intellectuals who routinely condemn virtually any use of force by democracies, the support for unilateral disarmament during the latter part of the Cold War by movements such as the British Labour Party and the Left and the Greens in Germany, providing additional intellectual, moral, and financial support for the spread of pacifism have been organizations such as Physicians for Social Responsibility. How do otherwise decent people justify embracing a doctrine that leads to limitless cruelty? When challenged, pacifists and their sympathizers generally offer one or more of these arguments. 1. It is simply and always wrong to kill another human being. 2. The Ten Commandments states, "Thou shalt not kill." 3. Human life is the supreme value. 4. The best answer to the problem of combating evil is the doctrine of nonviolence as practiced by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. 5. You can't fight violence with violence. 6. Nuclear weapons have made pacifism a moral imperative. It is necessary to show why these arguments are not moral. Only then can we remove the mantle of morality from the pacifists and return it to those who believe that sometimes to be a good person means you must kill. Pacifist Argument 1. It is always wrong to kill another human being. The key word here is always. The moment you do not mean always, you are no longer a pacifist, but are, like the rest of us, a proponent of the moral use of violence and thus an opponent of pacifism. The moment you affirm the morality of killing Hitler during World War II or killing a sniper who was shooting schoolchildren, you are an opponent of pacifism and an advocate of the moral use of violence. The question is, therefore, not whether killing is ever moral, but when is killing moral? Sometimes the answer is perfectly clear, such as when there is no other way to protect an innocent human life. And sometimes the answer is less clear, such as the Allied bombing of Dresden during World War II. But one thing is entirely clear. By prohibiting moral killing, pacifism ensures immoral killing, that is, murder. There is in sum moral killing and immoral killing. The latter is known as murder, which is why we have two words for the taking of human life. Pacifist Argument 2. Thou shalt not kill. Now we can understand why the above is not what the Ten Commandments commands. It is an erroneous translation. The sixth commandment reads, "Thou shalt not murder." Like English, Hebrew distinguishes between killing and murder. According to the Bible, killing can sometimes be justifiable, even virtuous, whereas murder, the deliberate killing of an innocent person, is deemed the most evil of acts. As related in Exodus, Moses, the greatest human in the Hebrew Bible, killed a slave master who was beating a slave. This biblical hero deliberately killed a man, an act that God, who thereafter chose Moses as his prophet, apparently deemed virtuous. Pacifist Argument 3. Human life is the supreme value. This is pacifism's fundamental tenet and its fatal flaw. It is this belief that enables pacifists to avoid confronting the cruel consequences of their beliefs. The belief that life is the supreme value is contrary to the normative moral codes that are the bases of our civilization, from Judaism and Christianity to democracy and national independence. These codes and ideals, as well as common sense, hold that at times life must be sacrificed for the sake of morality. Pacifism, however, holds the direct opposite. Morality must be sacrificed for the sake of life. If life is the highest value, everything else is by definition of lower value. Justice, decency, morality, kindness, and all other noble values are rendered less important than life. Pacifism means biology takes precedence over morality. Long lives are more valuable than good lives. It's not surprising that secular ideas, because they reject a reality beyond life, should lead to the veneration of life. After all, what else is there but life? But it is quite shocking that religious Christians or Jews should flirt with, let alone embrace, the idea that life is always higher than all other values. The essential message of Judaism and Christianity is that life is not an end in itself. Life is to be a means to goodness, sanctity, and to God. The belief in life as an end in itself is a form of idolatry. Pacifist Argument 4. Nonviolence is the best way to resist evil. The nonviolent resistance espoused and practiced by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. in their respective struggles against British imperialism and American racist institutions was a major moral achievement. It attained its moral ends without recourse to killing. In many instances, however, nonviolence would not only not attain its moral ends, it would lead to the triumph of the evil it wished to resist. When a Winston Churchill is the enemy, nonviolence is an appropriate moral response. But when Stalin, Hitler, Pol Pot, Idi Amin, Saddam Hussein, a death squad, or Charles Manson is the enemy, nonviolence is suicidal for the innocent and ensures victory for the evil. Against Nazism, communism, terrorism, or murderers in crime-infested cities, nonviolent resistance is literally meaningless. All it does is increase violence. Pacifist Argument 5. You can't fight violence with violence. The essence of this argument is that when you use violence to fight evil, you are fighting evil with evil, and you become the moral equivalent of the evil you're fighting. This pacifist contention that fighting violence with violence is always wrong is an example of the pernicious doctrine of moral equivalence. All violence is morally equivalent. The person who kills a murderer is morally equated with the murderer. The most obvious rejoinder to the argument that you can't fight violence with violence is, with what then will you fight criminal violence? Pacifist Argument 6. Nuclear weapons necessitate pacifism. Grant that nuclear war does challenge previous theories of just wars. In conventional war, good could vanquish evil. In a nuclear war, it is conceivable that no one, neither the good nor the evil, would survive. But this fact doesn't render pacifism moral. It was an immoral doctrine when humanity's survival was not at stake, and it remains so in the nuclear age. Even if one believes that the use of any nuclear weapons will lead to the end of the human race, there is no reason we should be absolved from fighting evil whenever possible with non-nuclear weapons. A moral case can be made for an individual's refusal to use nuclear weapons in time of war on the grounds that it can lead to the end of humanity. But this has nothing to do with pacifism nor with the doctrine of nonviolence. It is the refusal to fight in a specific war on moral grounds. Pacifist opposition to all wars, even conventional ones to save innocent Cambodians, Jews, Ugandans, or oneself, remains as immoral in the nuclear age as it was before. It still involves acquiescence in evil. Killing must always be the last resort. Every nonviolent attempt to stop evil must be made first. But last resort means just that. When all other attempts fail, violence must be used to fight violence. Part 3. There is a solution to evil. Why aren't people preoccupied with good and evil? Is there anyone who does not fear that he, she, or a loved one will be hurt by someone? Is there an American city dweller who does not fear being robbed, beaten, or murdered? Or a woman who does not fear also being raped? Given humanity's history of enslavement and mass murder, especially in our century, when well over 100 million people have been killed by other people, is there anyone who doesn't fear evil? One would think that people would be preoccupied with relentlessly promoting good and fighting evil. That many other concerns take precedence is truly a riddle. One would think that enlightened self-interest, if not morality, would prevail, yet it doesn't. For this reason, before discussing whether a solution to evil exists, we first need to answer the question, why aren't people preoccupied with fighting evil? Lack of empathy. Many people lack the character trait most needed in order to treat others decently, empathy. While a minority of people seem to have an innate capacity to empathize with others' suffering, most people need to learn it. It does not come naturally to see others as equally real or as fully human. That is why most people need to learn that people of different races, creeds, and nationalities are just as human as they. Most men and women, even within the same group, need to learn that the other sex is composed of real people, not just members of the opposite sex. Weakness. Humans also tend to be weak. Even when people do know right from wrong, they may do the wrong thing because it is often more difficult and sometimes dangerous to do what is right. You don't have to be evil in order to commit evil. It is enough, for example, merely to be lazy. To do good often necessitates suppressing fear, acting courageously, and overcoming laziness. Quite a large order. Personal problems. To varying degrees, all people have emotional and psychological problems. Nearly all people also have economic problems and family difficulties. These burdens can easily preoccupy a person, and when they do, it is the rare person who can find time and energy to fight for others. I've got my own problems. The last thing I need to worry about are Tibetans. It means making moral judgments. The moment you take ethical issues seriously, you must begin to make moral judgments, both of yourself and others. This has two unpleasant consequences: subjecting yourself to constant moral scrutiny and publicly opposing other people's immoral behavior. Since this means that some people will hate you and fight you, and that others will pass judgment over you, it is much easier not to make moral judgments. It means confronting evil. Once you judge a person, government, group, or action as evil, you have to do something about it or live with a guilty conscience. Neither is a pleasant prospect. Confronting evil is unpleasant and possibly dangerous, and a guilty conscience is a source of misery. It means believing in a higher moral law. In order to make moral judgments, you have to posit a universal moral code. If you do not, then they are right who contend that whether you choose to save your dog or a person is entirely a matter of personal opinion. Only if you posit a code that is higher than personal or societal opinion, which says that human life is more sacred than animal life, can you say that it is wrong to save the dog you love rather than the stranger whom you don't love. Unfortunately, many members of this past generation of Americans and other Westerners have been raised not to believe in a higher moral law, but only that there are differing personal opinions, all valid. Moral judgments are difficult. Another obstacle to people's preoccupation with good and evil is the difficulty involved in having to morally assess every action in every circumstance. It is easier to label certain actions as always right or as always wrong than to have to judge each action within its context. It is easier, for example, to say invasions are wrong than to assess the morality of every invasion. Some invasions are moral, such as the D-Day invasion at Normandy, and some are immoral, such as the Soviet invasions of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan. And some are morally ambiguous, the American invasion of Panama, for example. No specific action is always wrong. We always need to know the context in order to make a moral judgment. People who fight moral relativism often believe that situational ethics, determining what is right by the situation or context, is identical with moral relativism. Morality is a matter of opinion. It isn't. Situational ethics means determining the ethics of an act by the context in which it happened. And that is a moral position, not moral relativism. The way to fight moral relativism is with universal morality, meaning that a given act is wrong for everyone in that situation, and therefore not a matter of personal opinion. Preoccupation with other values. The final and perhaps most important reason for many people's lack of preoccupation with goodness is that other concerns, frequently even honorable ones, divert their attention from moral issues. People's attention is seduced by countless other worthwhile interests and values, which frequently are more glamorous and compelling than goodness. The only solution to evil: ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism means two things. 1. There is one God from whom emanates one morality for all humanity. 2. God's primary demand of people is that they act decently toward one another. If all people subscribe to this simple belief, which does not entail leaving or joining any specific religion or giving up any national identity, the world would experience far less evil. Let me now explain the components of ethical monotheism. God. Monotheism means belief in one God. Before discussing the importance of the mono, or God's oneness, we need a basic understanding of the nature of the theism of God. The God of ethical monotheism is the God first revealed to the world in the Hebrew Bible. Through it we can establish God's four primary characteristics. God is supranatural, God is personal, God is good, God is holy. Dropping any one of the first three attributes invalidates ethical monotheism. It is possible, though difficult, to ignore holiness and still lead an ethical life. Supranatural. God is supranatural, meaning above nature. I do not use the more common term supernatural because it's less precise and conjures up irrationality. This is why Genesis, the Bible's first book, opens with, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." In a world in which nearly all people worship nature, the Bible's intention was to emphasize that nature is utterly subservient to God who made it. Obviously, therefore, God is not a part of nature, and nature is not God. It is not possible for God to be a part of nature for two reasons. First, nature is finite, and God is infinite. If God were within nature, he would be limited, and God, who is not physical, has no limits. I use the pronoun he not because I believe God is a male, but because the neuter pronoun it depersonalizes God. You cannot talk to, relate to, love, or obey an it. Second, and more important, nature is amoral. Nature knows nothing of good and evil. In nature there is one rule, survival of the fittest. There is no right, only might. If a creature is weak, kill it. Only human beings could have moral rules such as, if it is weak, protect it. Only human beings can feel themselves ethically obligated to strangers. Thus, nature worship is very dangerous. Nature allows you to act naturally, to do only what you want to do without moral restraints. God does not. Nature lets you act naturally, and it is as natural to kill, rape, and enslave as it is to love. One of the vital elements in the ethical monotheist revolution was its repudiation of nature as God. If God is divine and has a will of its own, the only way for human beings to conquer disease or obtain sustenance is to placate it through witchcraft, magic, voodoo, and/or human sacrifice. One of ethical monotheism's greatest battles today is against the increasing deification of nature, movements which are generally led, as were most radical ideologies, by well-educated, secularized individuals. Personal. The second essential characteristic is that God is personal. The God of ethical monotheism is not some depersonalized force. God cares about his creations. God is not an unmoved mover, not a watchmaker who abandoned his watch after making it as the Enlightenment deists would have it. God knows each of us. We are, after all, created in his image. This is not merely wishful thinking. Why would God create a being capable of knowing him while he would choose not to know that being? This does not mean that God necessarily answers prayers or even that God intervenes in all or even any of our lives. It means that he knows us and cares about us. Caring beings are not created by an uncaring being. God is good. A third characteristic of God is goodness. If God weren't moral, ethical monotheism would be an oxymoron. A God who is not good cannot demand goodness. Unlike all other gods believed in prior to him, the biblical God rules by moral standards. Thus, in the Babylonian version of the flood story, the gods, led by Enlil, sent a flood to destroy mankind, saving only Utnapishtim and his wife, because Enlil personally likes Utnapishtim. It is an act of caprice, not morality. In the biblical story, God also sends a flood, saving only Noah and his wife and family. The stories are almost identical, except for one overwhelming difference. The entire Hebrew story is animated by ethical, moral concerns. God brings the flood solely because people treat each other, not God, badly. And God saves Noah solely because Noah was, quote, the most righteous person in his generations, unquote. Words cannot convey the magnitude of the change wrought by the Hebrew Bible's introduction into the world of a God who rules the universe morally. God is holy. As primary as ethics are, man cannot live by morality alone. We are also instructed to lead holy lives. You shall be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy, it says in Leviticus. God is more than the source of morality. He is the source of holiness. Ethics enables life. Holiness ennobles it. Holiness is the elevation of the human being from his animal nature to his being created in the image of God. To cite a simple example, we can eat like an animal with our fingers belching from the floor while relieving ourselves, or elevate ourselves to eat from a table with utensils, napkins, and keeping our digestive sounds quiet. It is, however, very important to note that a person who eats like an animal is doing something unholy, not immoral. The distinction lost upon many religious people is an important one. One God and one morality. The oneness of God is an indispensable component of ethical monotheism. Only if there is one God is there one morality. Two or more gods mean two or more divine wills and therefore two or more moral codes. That is why ethical polytheism is impossible. Once God told Abraham that human sacrifice is wrong, it was wrong. There was no competing God to teach otherwise. One morality also means one moral code for all humanity. Thou shalt not murder means that murder is wrong for everyone, not just for one culture. It means that sati, the now rare but once widespread Hindu practice of burning widows with their husband's body, is wrong. It means the killing of a daughter or sister who lost her virginity prior to marriage, practiced to this day in parts of the Arab world, is immoral. While in theory the celebration of multicultural is neither offensive nor original, in actuality multiculturalism is yet another attempt to undermine ethical monotheism. Its underlying assumption is that there is no one universal moral code and therefore all cultures are morally equal. One humanity. One God who created human beings of all races means that all of humanity are related. Only if there is one Father are all of us brothers and sisters. Human life is sacred. Another critical moral ramification of ethical monotheism is the sanctity of human life. Only if there is a God in whose image human beings are created is human life sacred. If human beings do not contain an element of the divine, they are merely intelligent animals. For many years I have been warning that a totally secular worldview will erode the distinction between humans and animals. The popular contemporary expression, all life is sacred, is an example of what secularism leads to. It means that all life is equally sacred, that people and chickens are equally valuable. Such views don't so much enhance the value of animal life as they reduce the value of human life. God's primary demand is goodness. Ethical monotheism suggests more than that God demands ethical behavior. It means that God's primary demand is ethical behavior. It means that God cares about how we treat one another more than he cares about anything else. Thus, ethical monotheism's message remains as radical today as when it was first promulgated. The secular world has looked elsewhere for its values, while even many religious Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe that God's primary demand is something other than ethics. Jews and ethical monotheism. Since Judaism gave the world ethical monotheism, one would expect that Jews would come closest to holding its values. In some important ways, this is true. Jews do hold that God judges everyone, Jew or Gentile, by his or her behavior. Judaism has never believed that non-Jews have to embrace Judaism in order to attain salvation or any other reward in the afterlife. But within Jewish religious life, the picture changes. The more observant the Jew is, the more he or she is likely to assume that God considers ritual observances to be at least as important as God's ethical demands. This erroneous belief is as old as the Jewish people. It is one against which the prophets passionately railed. "Do I, God, need your many sacrifices?" cried out Isaiah. What God does demand is justice and goodness based on faith in God. "O man," taught the prophet Micah, "God has told you what is good and what God requires of you, only that you act justly, love goodness, and walk humbly with your God." In Judaism, the commandments between human beings and God are extremely significant, but they are not as important as ethical behavior. That is why when the great Rabbi Hillel was asked by a pagan to summarize all of Judaism, quote, while standing on one leg, unquote, he was able to do so. What is hateful to you, do not do to others. The rest is commentary. Now go and study. Hillel could have said, keep the 613 commandments of the Torah, now go and do them. But he didn't. After enunciating his ethical principle, he concluded, the rest is commentary. In other words, the rest of Judaism is essentially a commentary on how to lead an ethical life. Unfortunately, with no more direct messages from God and few Hillels, the notion that the laws between man and God and the laws between people are equally important gained ever wider acceptance in religious Jewish life. Yet while observant Jews may overstress the monotheism and ethical monotheism, secular Jews believe that ethics can be separated from God and religion. The results have not been positive. The ethical record of Jews and non-Jews involved in causes that abandoned ethical monotheism has included involvement in moral relativism, Marxism, and the worship of art, education, law, etc. The lesson for religious Jews is never to forget the primacy of ethics. The lesson for secular Jews is to realize that ethics cannot long survive the death of monotheism. Christians and ethical monotheism. While the challenge to making ethics primary in Judaism is largely one of Jews rather than of Judaism, the challenge to Christianity is more rooted in the religion itself. Within Christianity, the doctrine developed that correct faith, not correct works, is God's primary concern. Paul articulated this view in the New Testament. If good deeds could lead to salvation, he reasoned in Galatians 2:21, Christ would have died in vain. For that reason, he continued in Romans 3:28, we conclude that a man is put right with God only through faith, and not by doing what the law commands. True, Catholicism holds that faith alone is not sufficient, that some works too are necessary for salvation. But between faith in Christ and goodness in behavior, the Church has until recently nearly always taught that faith is more important. Thus the Church held for nearly 2 millennia that even the kindest non-Christians were all doomed. Outside of the Church there is no salvation. In a major move toward ethical monotheism, the 20th century Catholic Church has reinterpreted this statement and now teaches that only God judges who is saved, and Catholics cannot declare who they are. Historically, the thrust of church teachings has not been that cruelty or unethical behavior is the greatest sin. There also are statements attributed to Jesus that can lead a Christian to abandon the fight against evil. Resist not evil is the prime example. Others include, pray for those who persecute you, love your enemies, and Jesus' prayer on the cross beseeching God to forgive his murderers. Another area of Christian theology that undermines ethical monotheism is the belief that God saves human beings irrespective of how they act toward each other, just as long as they have the right faith. Millions of Protestants hold that believers in Jesus, no matter how many cruel acts they may perform, attain salvation, while non-believers in Jesus, no matter how much good they do and how much they may love God, are doomed to eternal damnation. In spite of these teachings, 2 points need to be emphasized. First, it is Christianity more than any other religion, including Judaism, that has carried the message of the Jewish prophets, the clearest voices of ethical monotheism, to the world. Second, Christianity, though not theologically pure in its ethical monotheism, can and does lead millions of people to more ethical lives. People do not live by theology alone. Theological teachings aside, the kindness and selflessness often associated with religious Christians and with charitable Christian institutions are rarely paralleled anywhere in the secular world, and infrequently in the religious world either. Muslims and ethical monotheism. During some of the Western world's darkest periods, Islam was a religious light in the monotheistic world. The seeds of ethical monotheism are deeply rooted in Islam. For whatever reason, however, the soil for their nourishment has, over the last several hundred years, been depleted of some necessary nutrients. Islam could be a world force for ethical monotheism, but in its present state, the outlook is problematic. The Quran has numerous verses that emphasize belief in the one universal God who judges people according to their behavior. Like all religions, however, Islam contains xenophobic elements, and doctrines that are incompatible with ethical monotheism. Unlike some other religions today, however, within Islam, xenophobia and hostility to ethical monotheism too often seem to prevail. For example, though the Quran states explicitly that in matters of faith there shall be no coercion, almost everywhere Islam dominates there is considerable religious coercion, whether by the state or by the community. Muslims need what most Christians and Jews have experienced: separation of church and state, interaction with other faiths and with modernity, and reform. Islam needs to compete with secularism, not outlaw it, and to allow competing ideologies within Islam. In religion, as in politics, when there is no competition, there is corruption and intolerance. Conclusion. As the 20th century ends, most people have still not learned its most obvious lesson: that attempts to change the world that do not place God and goodness at their center will make this world worse. Is it not time to try ethical monotheism? It is truly the only effective answer to moral relativism, to racism, to nationalism, to worshiping art or law or success. All one needs to do is live by the simple and revolutionary message of Micah: to do justice, love goodness, and walk humbly with your God. Is this life all there is? Thoughts on God. I once attended a funeral at which a prominent rabbi officiated. At the grave, the rabbi spoke about Judaism's attitude toward death. Judaism does not believe in a life after death, he said. Rather, we live on in the good works we do and in the memories of those we leave behind. Because this is what most contemporary Jews believe, few people at the funeral found reason to take particular notice of these remarks. But I was furious. The rabbi had told Jews a profound untruth at a moment of deep impressionability. A Jew who believes that there is no reality beyond death is certainly entitled to hold such a belief. He may even be right. But that is his belief, not Judaism's. Judaism is unambiguous in its affirmation of a hereafter. True, Judaism gives no details about what happens after death because it wants its adherents to focus on this world, quote, to repair the world under the rule of God. But this affirmation of this world in no way implies that this life is all there is. Since Judaism and all monotheistic religions are predicated upon the existence of a God who is non-physical and beyond nature, and who is just and loving, our physical existence cannot be the only reality. It defies logic to hold that the non-physical God would create a world whose only reality is physical. And it is illogical that a just and loving God would create a world wherein the sum total of the existence of any of his creations is often cruel suffering. To state this case as starkly as possible, if there is nothing after this life, then the Nazis and the children they threw alive into furnaces have identical fates. If I believed such a thing, I would either become an atheist or hate the God who had created such a cruel and absurd universe. Furthermore, those who believe that this life is the only reality are likely to be led to one or more of three negative conclusions about life. 1. Hedonism. If this life is all one has, then it is quite logical to live a life devoted to self-gratification. If the physical is the only reality, we should experience as much physical pleasure as possible. 2. Utopianism. Idealistic people who believe that this life is all there is reject hedonism. But they may embrace a far more dangerous ideology, utopianism, the desire to make heaven on earth. Hence the attraction of utopianism to many 20th century radicals who have rejected Judaism and Christianity. Had people like the Bolsheviks and millions of other secular radicals not tried to create heaven on earth, they wouldn't have created hell here. 3. Despair. The malaise felt by so many people living in modern Western society is not traceable to material deprivation, but at least in part to the despair induced by secularism and its belief that this world is all there is. That is why peasants with religious faith are probably happier than affluent people who have no faith. As for the rabbi's statement that we live on through the memories of loved ones, what would the rabbi say about the millions of Jews, every one of whose loved ones also died during the Holocaust? If people live on solely through the memories of their loved ones, then most of the 6 million are forgotten smoke. Those who wish to believe that this life is all there is are certainly welcome to do so. But they should be honest enough to acknowledge that this belief renders the lives of most people little more than a cruel joke. Is God lovable? I have long argued the case for belief in God. On purely rational grounds, the arguments for God's existence strike me as far stronger than the arguments against it. The real problem when one really thinks the issue through is not believing in God, it is loving God. The problem is not really how do you believe that there is a God when so many children die from natural causes or when so many innocents die at the hands of other people. The problem is how do you love such a God? After pondering this question for some time, I have concluded that we ought to love God for these reasons. First, God created us out of love. The proof is that we love life. Why else would He have created us? God, after all, doesn't need us, and if He did, He would even be more lovable. Second, God created us with the ability and deep desire to experience love. Only a lovable God would do that, or could do that. Third, only a lovable God would command us to love Him. Why else would He want our love? And be sensitive enough to understand that without such a commandment, we might not be so predisposed. Nevertheless, it is very hard to witness the horrible suffering that people endure, and at the same time love the God who made a world in which such suffering is built in. We can blame man-made evils on man, but we can't blame people for deformed babies or genetic diseases. The God who made Alzheimer's isn't easily loved. So where do I stand? I still have problems with loving God, but I am thankful for a religion that allows me to have such ambivalence and to express it without guilt. It is comforting to know that the biblical name for the Jewish people, Israel, means struggle with God. Can we make deals with God? I have come to realize that many religious people of all faiths believe that they should be able to avoid the calamities that afflict the less pious. They believe, in effect, that they can make a deal with God. I'll do what you want, so that you do what I want. The problem is not merely that of reconciling the terrible injustices of this world with a just Creator, a problem that I and many others have. For countless people, this issue is compounded by their belief that God has reneged on a deal with them. I have never believed that there is a connection between my religious observance and God granting me anything in this world. I have always assumed that the purpose of religious practice is to affect my behavior, not God's. The purpose of leading a religious life is to make us better human beings, to bring us closer to God, to add holiness to our lives, and to make a just society. These are all rewards in and of themselves. To expect an additional reward for being religious is analogous to expecting an additional reward for following the rules and learning how to use a computer. Your reward is that you can now use the computer. Judaism does believe that God rewards the good and punishes the evil, but that is in the afterlife. If God provides this worldly rewards for keeping His laws, then the converse must also be true. All suffering is a punishment from God. I have seen this cruel belief at work. I witnessed a particularly fine Orthodox Jew slowly waste away from a tumor, while a member of his family told him that if he engaged in enough repentance for his past sins, God would remove the tumor. Such thinking is not only cruel. Instead of offering compassion to the suffering, we imply that they have somehow earned their plight, but also is a desecration of God's name, in that it depicts God as vindictive. Moshe didn't observe the Sabbath as he should, so I'll give him a tumor. When I hear a religious person say that he expects rewards in this world for his religiosity, I suspect that this individual is forcing himself to be religious, lest he lose his health and life insurance policies with God. That is why, whenever I meet joyless, angry, or stern religious people of whatever religion, I assume that they really don't want to be doing what they're doing. It shows when people love what they are doing and derive pleasure from it, just as it shows when they don't. One solution to this problem lies in having different attitudes toward the two basic types of religious laws, those between people and God, laws of holiness, and those between people, laws of ethics. It doesn't matter if people are ethical because they have made a deal with God, but it does matter if people observe the rituals because of a deal. The downtrodden do not care why people help them. They only care that people help them. But when it comes to the laws between man and God, it does matter why a Jew keeps the Sabbath, why a Christian regularly attends church, or why a Muslim observes the laws of Ramadan. If one gives charity solely out of fear of God, the act is still entirely beneficial. But if one observes the ritual practices solely out of fear of God, and or the community, which is often the case, the act eventually becomes almost meaningless and can even become ugly. Religious life would be greatly enriched if people who were religiously observant would drop their belief in deals with God. If they then observed fewer rituals, but observed them because they believed in the intrinsic worth of these practices, they would radiate a joy and kindness that would make religion the beautiful way of life it can be, but so often is not. If you enjoyed this abridged version of Think a Second Time, please remember that the unabridged book has about 3 times the amount of material. I thank you for listening and invite you to call my office for information on my courses and lectures on tape and my quarterly journal, Ultimate Issues. The number is 800-225-8584. I hope you enjoyed my book.
We hope you've enjoyed this program from Harper Audio. To order additional cassettes or to receive a complete catalog of Harper Audio and Cadman titles, please call us at 1-800-331-3761. That's 1-800-331-3761. Thank you.